and the congressman you have on, if you can volunteer in another state,
So get out there, get active, tag You're It, and check out indivisible.org and
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are Raycon Earbuds. Stay at home with better sound. More info at buyraycon.com/Tom. Omega XL, which according to clinical research helps joints. More info at omegaxl.com/Tom. CB Distillery, CBD for sleeping. More info at cbdistillery.com, code TOM. The Clean Phone Pro, phone sanitizer and charger. More info at thenewdealshop.com. Keeps hair loss treatment. More info at keeps.com/Tom. And Teeth, Smarter Pet Dental Health. For more info, teeth.com, code TOM.
We say fight back!
our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Health Justice Now, Single Payer and What Comes Next by Timothy Faust. And this is from the introduction. A secret scream rings through America. It rings down the sterile fluorescent hallways of our hospitals. It rings over our rural towns and our native reservations. It rings through our prisons, the bellies of our great cities. It rings in our farms, in our fields, our streets and our sewers, our bodies and our blood. And we are cursed to never hear it clearly until at last we realize it has been our own mouth screaming and we are lost. A child born today inherits in that secret a new American squalor, the skeletal remains of the American cities, the bleached bones of the American suburbs. This secret is a birthright of continual exploitation, pumped for labor and drained of cash and then punished for the resulting suffering. Punished for being hungry, punished for being sick, punished for being pregnant, punished for being poor, punished for being black or brown, punished for being queer, for being unlucky, for being. At the base of that suffering is lodged a little truth, like a knot in the stomach. In America, sickness makes you poor, and poorness makes you sick. This is a book about that relationship and why it happens, and why it's unnecessary, and what we can do to fix it. The cosmic whirling of God's great slot machine has not determined that some people are fated to suffer while others flourish. We have the resources to take care of everyone, and yet we refuse to do so. Your medical debt and medical bills are unnecessary, but we have chosen to make them necessary. These are structural problems with structural causes, and many of them share roots in how we pay for health care. This is a book about health care and health finance. They are different. Health care is anything that helps you stay safe and healthy. It's a kind of freedom from and within your own body. Health finance is the method by which we as a country pay for that freedom and by which we decide who gets to have it and who doesn't. Health care is more than what happens to you in the hospital. Health care is whether your home makes you sick, or your food makes you sick, or your environment makes you sick, or whether you have enough money to afford the things that keep you healthy. In America, the structure of corporate health care has convinced us that some people deserve health care and some people don't. This is a book about that corporate health finance, about private insurance and private insurers. For half a century, they've convinced us that they're the only things that keep us or could ever keep us from the utter financial ruination of illness. They've sold us different inadequate insurance plans and persuaded us that this is a form of great liberty, while chipping away at our freedoms for profit and holding our bodies and our children's bodies hostage. This is a book about single-payer health care, a health finance model in which we pool our abundant collective resources to provide health care to all people. It is a common model across the world. As we will discuss in this book, we have the potential not just to enact a single-payer program in America, but to build the greatest health care program among any so-called developed democracy. Here is my profession of faith. I believe beyond any doubt that single payer is demonstrably sound and imminently feasible. I believe a properly ambitious and well-structured single-payer program will do more than any other American social program of this generation to soothe the burns, to resuscitate the spirit, to nourish the moral will of the American people. I believe it will loosen the loathsome manacles of American health finance, an exploitative institution that profits by plundering from us our own bodily autonomy, and that anchors a larger exploitation that holds those whom we love as captive leverage to guarantee our servitude to abusive employers or domestic partners, to those who seek to dominate us both in the office and in the hospital. I believe this nation owes its people, whose labor has created its rich banquet, the safety and agency of health care. I believe this health care is greater in scope than that which happens upon an operating table. I believe that housing, food, income, and more, the components of basic human dignity, are health care. And I believe our work is that of striving toward justice for all people. And I therefore believe, I have to believe, that single-payer health care is our moral imperative. Single-payer is our tool. Single-payer is our weapon. Single-payer is our first step. But single-payer on its own is not the goal. This book is about health justice. Healthcare is personal, so I want to start this book personally by introducing two friends of mine, Steve Way and Kyle Kolick. They're two guys about my age, I'm 30, who live in North New Jersey. They're sweet, gentle people, and probably the most charismatic pair of friends I've met in my entire life. They make me laugh until my face hurts, and we like watching pro wrestling together. They're also being utterly broken by our American healthcare system, and it's keeping them from living their lives. Steve has muscular dystrophy. The muscle and tissues that hold his body together are eating themselves. He's doing pretty good, all things considered. He beat his original life expectancy of 18 and now probably has a long life ahead of him. Steve needs a wheelchair to move and a ventilator to help him breathe. The book, Health Justice Now, Timothy Faust.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Wow, what a convention kickoff last night. Michelle Obama just knocked it out of the park. I thought Bernie Sanders did a brilliant job of speaking to people like me, basically people who have supported him for years and years and share his perspective on politics. It was extraordinary. We've got a huge show today. Mimi Kennedy's going to drop by in about 45 minutes, the star of Moms. She's also on the board of Progressive Democrats of America. She's going to be talking about how to check your voter registration, a pretty important thing. In our second hour, Dr. Michael Greger is going to drop by. What can we do to stop the spread of animal-derived diseases? Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, the chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, among other things, been on the program a number of times over the years, the oldest daughter of Robert Kennedy. And Ben Wikler, who is Ben Wikler is the Wisconsin Democratic Party chair, not Kathleen Kennedy Townsend. But anyway, both of them will be here in the third hour on the convention. Today is the anniversary of the ratification 100 years ago today, the 19th Amendment, which gave, in 1920, which gave women the right to vote, or I think correctly frame it, with which women seized the right to vote. So there's just a lot going on, and and an enormous amount of news. But I think that the main theme of last night's Democratic convention, repeated over and over by multiple people, and we'll dig into that a little bit as we go through the 3 hours of our program today, is that Joe Biden is a decent man. A good guy that you can trust who actually has empathy and cares about other people, none of which are qualities that Donald Trump has. And that Donald Trump is corrupt, is incompetent, and is mentally ill. And I would add a coda to that as a consequence of his corruption, his incompetence, and his mental illness, he is actually a danger to the United States and has harmed the United States, has hurt us both domestically and abroad. Which raises three questions. How did we end up with a corrupt, incompetent, and mentally ill president? How did he get enough power to be able to twist the levers of government toward his own reelection, something that has not been done in the past in the United States and something that's a hallmark of tin pot dictators? And why do Republicans in the United States Senate continue to support him? And I think all the answers come back to basically two things. The answers of where did this power come from, by and large, setting aside the police powers for a moment, it goes back to 1976, 1978, the Buckley decision and the Bellotti decision before the U.S. Supreme Court that said, for the first time in the history of America, and this is what set up the Reagan Revolution, for the first time in the history of America, if a politician is owned by a billionaire, if a billionaire provides enough money to that politician that they are singularly responsible for that politician having their job, and they dance to the tune of that politician in all matters, we used to call that corruption. We used to call that bribery. It used to be illegal. The Supreme Court in 1976 said, if a billionaire wants to own a politician, or 10 politicians, or 100 politicians, or a whole political party, that is now, henceforth, forevermore, world without end, amen, going to be considered protected free speech under the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And then 2 years later, in the First National Bank versus Bellotti decision, the Supreme Court said, oh, by the way, we're extending this right to corporations, corporate persons, as well as to individual human being billionaires. And this began, basically the corruption of both the Democratic and Republican parties, but the Republican Party sold out entirely in 1980. It put Reagan over the top, and it massively expanded the influence of lobbyists who were the bribers, because now the bribees, the politicians, could openly take money and gifts and all kinds of goodies from these lobbyists. And, so the lobbyists, the industries, set out on a 40-year campaign that brought us what today we call the Trump administration, where literally every, I believe it's literally every, there might be a couple of exceptions to this rule, but if there are, they're not at the top of my consciousness. Every major government agency is now run by either a lobbyist or a person with an axe to grind, a billionaire with an axe to grind, like, Betsy DeVos over at Education, or billionaire Wilbur Ross over at Commerce. But basically the rest of them, the EPA is run by a coal lobbyist, the Interior Department is run by an oil lobbyist, the FCC is run by a telecom lobbyist. The list goes on and on and on. So he's basically corrupted all these things. And that's because of the Supreme Court decision. And then after 9/11, Congress created this new super police agency, consolidating a whole bunch of different police agencies together and intelligence agencies together, using the word that Rudolf Hess used first in 1937 when he introduced Adolf Hitler at the Nuremberg rally, where they decided to borrow a word from the Zionists who were trying to create a homeland for Jewish people in what we now call Israel in the Middle East. They borrowed that word, the Nazis, that word homeland, Heimat in German. They borrowed that word to apply to what had always previously been called the fatherland. And now it was called the homeland. And so, Bush took this word that had never been used to describe the United States. We never called this the homeland. This country is literally only the homeland to Native Americans. But it's got that good blood and soil, blood and earth, Blut und Erd, sound to it that the Nazis were so fond of. So George Bush and Dick Cheney named this new organization the Homeland Security Department. And all these massive police powers were reconsolidated or highly consolidated and concentrated under the office of the president, which is, why we were able to see Trump use these powers in Lafayette Park and here in Portland, as well as on our southern border. And he's using them now to track down and selectively prosecute people who are protesting in favor of democracy and against fascism. They are anti-fascists, Antifa. And Donald Trump is, he's often sabotaged by his own incompetence and his own mental illness. Like he blurted out like the post office thing, right? And had he not said that, probably he would have gotten away with a hell of a lot more of it than he did. But the next Republican president who wants to be a fascist dictator, I'm looking at you, Tom Cotton, will probably not be as impaired or as incompetent as Donald Trump. And we need to get ready for that. To save our republic, we need an immediate national discussion about how to break up or at least constitutionally constrain the Department of Homeland Security and get money out of politics at all levels. Now, that's assuming that we do take some political power. In Louisiana, for example, the Secretary of State, Kyle Ardoin, has a new plan. If you want an absentee ballot in Louisiana, you want to vote in the election without exposing yourself to COVID, right now, the way the Louisiana law is being enforced is that if you want an absentee ballot, you have to you have to give an excuse. And one of the acceptable excuses is, I have a pre-existing condition that puts me at risk for getting COVID. Like I'm over 50, or I'm overweight, or I have heart disease, or I have diabetes, or I have high blood pressure, whatever. But see, the problem with that is that at least a third of Americans have pre-existing conditions that make COVID very dangerous for them. So what he wants to do is say that you can only get an exemption, a COVID exemption, to get an absentee ballot in Louisiana if you have tested positive for the coronavirus. If you are on death's door, if you are really sick, then you can get a positive test, which is damn hard to do, because basically you can only get the test if you show up and say, I've got symptoms in Louisiana. And if you can get that test and it is positive, then you can vote if you're still alive. Right. Meanwhile, an 82-year-old man, Don White, in Humble, Texas, says he's been tracking his medications. They're 2 weeks late. It's been sitting for 10 days on the floor of the North Houston post office. His daughter had to get his heart medication at the local drugstore to hold him over.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
I mean, what's going on here is beyond a crisis. It's absolutely insane. What were your thoughts on the convention last night? I'm going to get into that in just a minute with Michelle Obama. Stick around. Welcome back. Jared in Downingtown, Pennsylvania. Hey, Jared, what's on your mind today?
Hello, Tom. I've just been recently cracking open an Oxford history book of Adolf Hitler by...
Jared, your phone is breaking up really badly. I'm going to put you on hold and let Joyce figure out what's going on. He's on line 1, Joyce, if you want to pick him up and see what's going on there. Patrick in Long Island, New York. Hey, Patrick, what's up?
Hey, Tom. You had mentioned this last week, and you just talked about it earlier today, and it had to do with the correlation between the Bush administration and the what was it again? The Patriot Act, and and where Trump is getting power today, and I think that there is a failure amongst the general public to really understand the strive that Cheney pushing Bush made for power, executive power, under that act, and that we're seeing Trump with the use of force and the use of his own little, private army type thing, which turns out of Border Patrol agents, correct?
Yeah, Patrick, your phone is breaking up too. I think when we finish this break,
I'm on a landline,
to reset our entire phone system.
Yeah, I'm on landline. It should be a good phone.
Yeah,
so that was my point.
I think it's on our end.
Okay, all right. I'm going to hang up then, Tom. Okay.
Okay, Patrick. Thank you very much. Yeah, Joyce and Sean. We need to completely reboot the phone system from top to bottom. So. Let's just get into a few things here that I think are very much worth detailing. The roughly 1,000 page report is out from the United States Senate, the Senate Intelligence Committee, and what they have found is that Donald Trump and his campaign were specifically interacting with Russian agents and Russian intelligence, and doing so enthusiastically and aggressively. They did not say, or were not able to conclude, that there was an actual conspiracy. It was more like, help was being asked for by Trump in his speech, hey, Russians, if you're listening, and then help was provided, and then that help was used. But if there is a smoking gun in this that probably a little more investigation needs to be done on, it's the relationship between Russian intelligence officer Konstantin Kilimnik and Paul Manafort. Manafort was conveying to Kilimnik actual polling data from the Republican campaign, from the Trump campaign in 2016. And others who were interacting with Russian intelligence services and their people included, according to this report, Paul Manafort, Jared Kushner, Donald Trump Jr. And that's troubling stuff, and stuff that probably really we really need to be paying attention to, and hopefully doing something about, essentially hardening our elections. I'm not holding my breath as long as Donald Trump is in office. I don't think that any foreign government should be messing in our elections, whether it's Russia or the UAE or Saudi Arabia or China or North Korea or whoever it may be. This is pretty overt, and pretty much the world knew about it as it was happening. We'll be back. Stick around. It's coming up on 20 minutes past the 11. The Hartmann Report is a free daily podcast 7 days a week, and you can find our entire 3-hour podcast over at thomhartmann.com. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. So last night, Michelle Obama just, peeled the skin off Donald Trump. I mean, it was extraordinary. And apparently he watched, because he was tweeting, or somebody told him about it, because he was... In fact, probably he saw somebody comment on it about it on Fox News. Louise and I flipped over to Fox News during the first hour of the convention, and there was Hannity talking to Don Jr. And So we went back to the convention. It's like, the gag reflex and all that. But Michelle Obama, she said, Donald Trump is the wrong president for our country. He has had more than enough time to prove that he can do this job, but he is clearly in over his head. He cannot meet this moment. He simply cannot be who we need him to be for us. It is what it is, she said, borrowing from his phrase. And spot on. And clearly it flipped out Donald Trump. He tweeted this morning, somebody please explain to Michelle Obama that Donald J. Trump would not be here in the beautiful White House if it weren't for the job done by your husband, Barack Obama. Let's see, what's that? Putting the economy back together after Republican George W. Bush crashed it? Restoring some integrity and honor to the White House after George Bush and Dick Cheney tortured and murdered people illegally? It's pretty breathtaking, and also how thin-skinned Donald Trump is. For example, now he's going after the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and this is, you would think it was funny, except that it's not. Right? New Zealand had beat the virus. They had gone 102 days without a single new case of the virus. They had somewhere in the neighborhood of about 100 people who were infected. They were all being quarantined. Everything was good. And then suddenly this virus popped up in this one family of this guy who was involved with this shipping company. And now they've got 12 cases. 12 cases. In Australia, in Victoria, Australia, they've also got a new little pop-up, a couple hundred cases in Australia. And in Australia, they all seem to be tied to one single hotel where they were quarantining people who had flown into the country, who had tested negative but still had to be quarantined for 14 days. Because just because you test negative doesn't mean you don't have the virus. It just means you've only had it for a couple days and it hasn't, the viral load hasn't reached the point where you can flip a test. So, kind of restarting the whole thing. I mean, it's just, so Australia is locking down again, and they're starting to very carefully pay attention to these people from who are coming in from outside the country, because basically they were infecting hotel staff, and hotel staff were infecting their families, and boom, it was starting to get into the community. Australia has locked it down. In New Zealand, they think it has a connection to this shipping company. And in fact, in both Japan and South Korea, they have identified coronavirus on frozen meats and fish that have come into that country from the United States. Now, they don't know if it's an active virus that can actually infect people, or if it's, the leftover fragments of a virus that died on the way. Died isn't quite the right word for a virus, but you get what I mean. They're still trying to figure that out, but they're pretty flipped out about it. And, obviously, anything coming out of the United States is going to probably be laced with virus right now, especially anything coming out of a meat packing plant in the United States. So what Trump says about New Zealand with their 12 cases, he said this in his rally last night. He did a rally to provide, and he's doing a rally every night of the DNC in order to provide Fox News with programming that they can run instead of the DNC speakers, presumably, or One American News or whatever, wherever the QAnon conspiracy folks who follow Donald Trump hang out. But this is what he said last night in his rally. He said, what you see going on in New Zealand, he said, they beat it. They beat it. It was like front page news. They beat it. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Donald Trump literally thinks everybody in the world does whatever they do because of him. This is how severely mentally ill and narcissistic this man is. He actually thought that Jacinda Ardern, or Ahern, however you say her name, Ardern, I believe, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, was trying to defeat the coronavirus to stick it to him. This is what he said last night. They beat it. It was like front page news. They beat it because they wanted to show me something. And then he said, but I was right? You can't stop this. You got to let it infect people like I am here in America. Those weren't his exact words. He said, there's a big surge in New Zealand. It's terrible. We don't want that. Right. 12 cases related to one family where dad works in a shipping company that's bringing meat in from the United States. Really? The article about this from Agence France-Presse, the French news service, notes, shortly after her stunning election win in 2017, Trump met Ahern at a summit in Vietnam and joked that, quote, "You've caused a lot of upset in your country." You know, of course, by being a woman who was elected, right? You can't have women running countries. I mean, that's, you know, in Trump world, that's just absurd. And so she said in response, this is what the Prime Minister of New Zealand back in 2017 said to Donald Trump. Well, you know, no one marched when I was elected. Right. So, you know, so much for Donald Trump's surge. There's, in all of Australia, in all of Victoria, there are 12,000 now COVID cases in Victoria, Australia. Victoria's a state. And in fact, it's the state where the capital is. And I believe it's the state. It doesn't here say state of Victoria. There's also a city. But in any case, almost all of the 12,000 COVID-19 cases recorded in Victoria, Australia since the end of May can be linked to an outbreak at a hotel where an infected family was quarantined after returning to the country. Amazing. We'll be back. It's 27 minutes past the hour. Stick around. We'll be back with your calls and more of the news of the day. And boy, do I have a pile of news here to get through. So we've got Miles Taylor, the latest whistleblower. It's
You're
amazing.
Listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And this isn't just any old whistleblower. This is a Department of Homeland Security whistleblower who blew the whistle in the Washington Post yesterday. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Fred Kaplan's new book, The Bomb, Presidents, Generals, and the Secret History of Nuclear War. This is from the introduction. For 30 years after the Cold War ended, almost no one thought, much less worried, about nuclear war. Now, almost everyone is fearful. But the fear takes the form of a vaguely paralyzed anxiety. Because of the long reprieve from the bomb's shadow, few people know how to grasp its dimensions. They've forgotten, if they ever knew. The holiday from history began on August 8th, 2017, when President Donald Trump, barely 6 months in office, told reporters at his golf resort in Bedminster, New Jersey, that if the North Koreans kept threatening the United States with harsh rhetoric and missile tests, quote, they would be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen, end quote. Even those who didn't remember President Harry Truman's similar description 72 years earlier of the atomic bomb that destroyed Hiroshima, Truman said, a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. It was clear that in language more bellicose than any president since the end of World War II, Trump was talking about launching nuclear weapons at North Korea. Not if its leader, Kim Jong-un, first attacked the United States, but merely if he developed the ability to do so. Then, 6 months later, Trump signed and released his administration's Nuclear Posture Review, a 74-page document that called for building new types of nuclear weapons and integrating them with the military's conventional war plans. In short, for treating nuclear weapons as normal. The red lights flashed. The alarm bells rang furiously. Yet here is what few recognized. None of these notions were new. The president himself seemed a departure from the norm. His character, erratic, eruptive, thin-skinned, willfully uninformed, a combustive mix for a world leader with his finger on the button. But the button and everything around it were the same. In those decades when most of us chose to forget the bomb, as global tensions calmed and fallout shelters crumbled and we turned our gaze to other problems and pleasures, the nuclear war machine continued to rumble forth in the beyond top-secret chambers of the Pentagon, the Strategic Command Headquarters in Omaha, the weapons labs in various parts of the country, and the think tanks whose denizens never stopped thinking about the unthinkable. They all kept at their singular task, wrestling with the dilemmas posed by the bomb's existence. how to deter nuclear war, how to fight a nuclear war if it cannot be deterred, how to win it if such a thing is even possible. This is the nature of the nuclear era, and the era never drifted into suspension, even if our attention did. Trump snapped us out of our slumber, reminded those of us who were old enough to know, and informed those who weren't that the bomb is still here. In public over the years, officers and officials have described America's nuclear policy as a second strike deterrence. If an enemy strikes us with nuclear weapons, we will retaliate in kind. This retaliatory power is what deters the enemy from attacking us. In reality, though, American policy has always been to strike first preemptively, or in response to a conventional invasion of Allied territory, or to a biological or large-scale cyber attack. In any case, not just as an answer to nuclear attack. All of these options envision firing nuclear weapons at military targets for military ends. They envision the bomb as a weapon of war writ large. This vision has been enshrined in the American military's doctrines, drills, and exercises from the onset of the nuclear era through all its phases. Most presidents have been skeptical of this vision, morally, strategically, practically, but none of them have rejected it. Some have threatened to launch nuclear weapons first as a way of settling a crisis. The few who considered adopting a no first use policy, in the end, decided against it. There are rationales for these doctrines, drills, and exercises, and for the retention of the first use option. They are driven by policies, personalities, and bureaucratic rivalries, but also by a logic which, once its premises are accepted, hurls its adherents and the rest of us into a rabbit hole of increasingly bizarre scenarios that seem increasingly, if strangely, rational the deeper they're probed. Understanding the nuclear era, the era of our lifetime, means understanding the rabbit hole, who dug it, and how we got stuck inside. It means tracing the maze of its tunnels, which is to say the arc of its history. A story enmeshed in secrecy, some of it still secret, much of it now illuminated by declassified documents and interviews with key actors, though never fully told. How did we get to this second coming of nuclear panic? How did we wind up with thousands of nuclear weapons, far more than any war aims could justify? What propelled the nuclear arms race during the decades-long Cold War? And what happened to the weapons and their guardians after the Cold War ended? And how and why did any of this persist? This is the Thom Hartmann Book Club, the book Fred Kaplan's The Bomb.
Coming up on the Science Revolution, Noah Greenwald from the Center for Biological Diversity is here on Trump's latest actions to weaken the Endangered Species Act. You know, as we destroy the wild, we destroy ourselves. Dr. Justin A. Frank, MD, drops by and says it is terrifying to have a president who is psychotic and explains why Trump hates anyone who is loved. Former Assistant Secretary for Health under Obama, Dr. Howard Koh, tells us how Biden will handle this pandemic we're in. And lastly, in Geeky Science, we find out how our bones are made of stars. The Science Revolution, wherever fine podcasts are available. So I got to tell you about Miles Taylor. And I mean, this is an absolutely remarkable story. Miles Taylor is a young man who rose up to become the chief of staff for the Department of Homeland Security. Working frequently in the White House, there are photos of him and Donald Trump. He wrote an op-ed in yesterday's Washington Post. It's in today's paper. And Donald Trump tweeted, "Many thousands of people work for our government. With that said, a former disgruntled employee named Miles Taylor, who I do not know, never heard of him, said he left and is on the open arms fake news circuit, said to be a real stiff. They will take anyone against us." Right. So Miles Taylor responds to Trump on Twitter with a photo of him and Trump smiling into the camera, both giving thumbs up. Right. Miles Taylor, by the way, is no saint. Miles Taylor was the number 2 to Kirstjen Nielsen when she was doing her family separation policy, and he did not resign or object. I mean, you know, this is a guy who's got a certain amount of blood on his hands. But nonetheless, he has said enough. Enough. The chief of staff of the Department of Homeland Security, he said, after serving for more than 2 years in the Department of Homeland Security's leadership during the Trump administration, I can attest that the country is less secure as a direct result of the president's actions. Now, then he gets into exactly why. And this is shocking, damning, sadly not surprising, but astonishing. He says the president has tried to turn the Department of Homeland Security, the nation's largest law enforcement agency, into a tool used for his political benefit. Now, let me add that, to the best of my knowledge, no president has ever successfully done that. Richard Nixon tried to get the Justice Department, or the FBI specifically, to investigate his political enemies, and he tried to get the IRS to audit people. Those 2 actions were one of the articles of impeachment against Nixon. That is not only unconstitutional behavior, it is illegal. Well, Trump was doing the same thing, not specifically the FBI and IRS, although God only knows what we're going to find when he leaves office, assuming that there's even a single piece of paper left over. But, you know, Trump is not only doing the same thing, but he's put it on steroids. So back to Miles Taylor. He says the president has tried to turn DHS, the nation's largest law enforcement agency, into a tool used for his own political benefit. He insisted on a near total focus on issues that were central to his reelection, in particular building a wall on the U.S. border with Mexico, though he was often talked out of bad ideas at the last moment. Not Miles Taylor writes in the Washington Post. The president would make obviously partisan requests of DHS, including when he told us to close the California-Mexico border during a March 28, 2019 Oval Office meeting. It would be better for him politically, he said, than closing, you know, he just wanted to close the California part of the border, which is shorter and easier to do, and most of it is already, you know, got a substantial wall, so it just involved closing some border crossings. So anyhow, he says, he told us to close the California-Mexico border. It would be better for him politically, he said, than closing long stretches of the Texas or Arizona border. Another time, Trump suggested, again, Miles Taylor writing, he told us to dump illegal immigrants in Democratic-leaning sanctuary cities and states to overload their authorities, as he insisted on several times. Then he talks about how Trump's lack of discipline, his inability to concentrate, his unwillingness to read was a, quote, constant source of frustration. One day, he writes, in February 2019, when congressional leaders were waiting for an answer from the White House on a pending deal to avoid a second government shutdown, the president demanded a DHS phone briefing. Now, keep in mind, the government's on the edge of being shut down. People won't get their Social Security checks. People won't, you know, veterans won't get their medication. I mean, it just, you know, it just disaster. A national disaster is on the horizon. And Donald Trump wants to spend his time on a briefing with DHS, quote, to discuss the color of the wall. He was particularly interested, Miles Taylor writes, in the merits of using spray paint and how the steel structure should be coated. And then Miles Taylor adds, episodes like this occurred almost weekly. He says the decision-making process was itself broken. Again, this is almost certainly because, A, Trump doesn't have any kind of attention span at all. He just flits from thing to thing, whatever happens to tickle his fancy. He really is the boy king. You know, I mean, if you were to take a young man and at a very early age Donald Trump started receiving an allowance, as it were, from his father of, I believe it was $100,000 a year when he was 3 years old. So you take a young man and you say, you, sir, are the golden one. You are the chosen one. You are rich. You are above mere mortals. You are not part of the rabble. And you can have whatever you want and you can do whatever you want because you are beyond challenge. You are beyond, any kind of problem at all. So you take this young man in a situation like this and what kind of damage does that do to his psychology? What kind of sociopathy does that create? This is, like I said, the boy king. This is the Mad King Ludwig. He built this castle in Bavaria. Louise and I have been there. It's totally strange. It's the castle that the Disney castle is based on. And it was the same thing. He was raised by distant parents who didn't much care about him and given anything he wanted whenever he wanted it. And he couldn't focus on things and he couldn't make reasonable decisions. And when he died, the people of southern Germany just erupted in applause, as it were. Well, back to Miles Taylor. He talks about the decision-making process was broken. Trump would abruptly endorse policy proposals with little or no consideration by him or his advisors of possible knock-on effects. He talks about an example in 2018 when Jeff Sessions, who was then the Attorney General, announced that at the White House urging a, quote, zero-tolerance policy to prosecute anyone who crossed the border illegally. The agencies involved were unprepared to implement the policy, Miles Taylor writes, causing a disastrous backlog of detentions that ultimately left migrant parents and their children separated. And then he goes on to say top DHS officials were regularly diverted from dealing with genuine security threats by the chore of responding to these inappropriate and often absurd executive requests. He says, incredibly, after this ill-conceived operation was rightly halted, this was the we've got everything here. In the following months, the president repeatedly exhorted DHS officials to restart it and to implement an even more deliberate policy of pulling migrant families apart en masse so that adults would be deterred from coming to the border for fear of losing their children. The president was visibly furious on multiple occasions when my boss, then Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, refused. You think there's an untold story here? It's certainly looking like it. He said one morning it might be a demand to shut off congressionally appropriated funds to a foreign ally that had angered him. And that evening it might be a request to sharpen the spikes atop the border wall so that they'd be more damaging to human flesh. How much will that cost us? Trump asked. Meanwhile, he says, Miles Taylor says, Trump showed vanishing little interest in subjects of vital national security interest, including cybersecurity, domestic terrorism, and malicious foreign interference in U.S. affairs. He points out that DHS has 250,000 employees. He says, you can't run an organization like this. This is nuts. My phrase, not his. His phrase was, at DHS, daily management of its 250,000 employees suffered because of these frequent follies, putting the safety of Americans at risk. And then he goes on to talk about, what has happened abroad. And mostly he cites John Bolton. And John Bolton, of course, said that Donald Trump had turned basically every foreign policy decision into something about whether or not it's going to help Donald Trump politically or whether or not it's going to make money for Trump hotel properties around the world, like in Turkey. He says the president has similarly undermined U.S. security abroad. He says Bolton got it right. Today, the nation has fewer friends and stronger enemies than when Trump took office. And then he gets into Trump's bungled response to coronavirus. He says this is the ultimate example. He says years of pandemic planning by DHS have been wasted. Yeah, you think? It's 45 minutes
You're
past
listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Stick around. We'll be back in just a few minutes.
Hey, thanks so much for supporting our program. There's a commonality between why Boris Johnson got elected in the UK and why Donald Trump got elected in the United States, and it has to do with immigration. In the UK, joining the European Union meant that there was unlimited travel among European Union countries. Britain is a very, very high-wage country. One of the, there's 4 or 5 very high-wage countries in the European Union, and so people from very low-wage countries, like Hungary, travel, or Poland, travel freely to England and literally move there, and are willing to work for a lot less than the average British person is willing to work for. And the effect of the UK joining the European Union has been a depression of wages. It's about 8 million people from low-wage countries now living in the UK and working for typically less than the wages used to be. And this is driving down wages all across the UK, and that's one of the main things that has been driving Brexit. Similarly, we've got around 10 million people in the United States who are working, who are here without documentation, without visas, and without citizenship, and that has had a suppressive effect somewhat on wages here in the United States. So the Republicans in the United States have been pointing to the so-called illegal aliens, and over in the UK, the whole Brexit thing and the whole Boris Johnson thing was about the Polish plumber. In fact, they had ads about Polish, plumbers coming from Poland, working for less than plumbers in the UK charge, and wiping out UK plumbers. So, the solution for the UK is going to be, in all probability, to simply separate from the European Union and tell the Polish plumbers to go back to Poland. The solution for the United States is pretty straightforward. Mitt Romney actually campaigned on this when he ran for president, and that is that instead of getting all hysterical about, quote, illegals, about people who have come here looking for work, instead, we should be enforcing the law that was, passed back in the 1980s that Reagan never chose to enforce, that sends employers to jail when they hire people who aren't here legally. Every other country in the world, pretty much. I've worked in Australia, and I had to get a work permit. I worked in Germany. I had to get a work permit. I lived there for a whole year. You have to get a visa and a permit. Every other country in the world basically enforces these things in order to control their labor markets. And this didn't used to be a point of contention between Democrats and Republicans, but Republicans, welcomed that cheap labor because it helped break the unions, particularly in the construction and meatpacking industries. And they're absolutely unwilling to send their employers to jail. And as Mitt Romney pointed out, for goodness sake, if we simply went after the employers, you stop basically the magnet. And then, of course, we have to have another conversation about refugees, because we do have a crisis on our southern border, and it's not people coming here to work, it's people fleeing climate change disasters in Guatemala and gangs and horrible problems in other countries in that region that we played a role in starting. And we need to have an honest discussion about that. All of this comes under the rubric of comprehensive immigration reform. But if you look at Trump's rhetoric around the wall and the people who support him, probably about 70% of them are actually concerned.
The Hidden History of Monopoly tells how Robert Bork, that guy from the Reagan era, transformed corporate America and destroyed the American dream. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. I caught this incredible little YouTube about how to check your voter registration that was done by actress, activist, writer, and the board chair, Progressive Democrats of America, Mimi Kennedy. She's also the star of the hit series Mom on CBS, or a star of it. PDAmerica, of course, .org, of course, is the website for Progressive Democrats. Mimi's Twitter handle is Mimi Kennedy LA. And I think Mimi's on the line with us. Mimi, are you there?
Yeah, I'm definitely here. How are you? Can you hear me
how
on
about
the
that?
phone? Hey.
I'm not sure if we're listening on your phone or on your Skype audio, but you sound great. So tell us, how do you check your voter registration? The thing that I think has confounded a lot of people is that it varies from state to state. So is there some way that we can all, kind of standardize on doing this?
Yeah, well, the way I did it was I just check my voter registration, and I got a menu of possibilities, and a big one was Can I Vote, which takes you to the National Association of the Secretaries of State, and then they take you to your state, and your state has the voter rolls. So that's how I did it. There are a lot of...
So hang on just a second, Mimi. You said I put this in. You put it into what? Are these like search terms? You put it into Google or into DuckDuckGo?
Yeah, I did in my browser, at that top of my phone or the top of my computer.
Right.
When I go to
So you basically search for those
Google,
words.
Can I vote? Just put in those words.
Okay.
It'll start you. Can I vote?
Okay. And what did you find?
And I found NASS, which is National Association of Secretaries of State, along with a lot of other vote.org. But I took the NASS because it's government. They're not going to send me emails and make me subscribe to stuff I don't want. And that took me to my state, California. It's what state are you in? And you say, I'm in this state. And then you go to your state website, and that's where the voter rolls are. Those are a state responsibility. Other aspects of voting are county responsibilities. But
right.
This
is very much step
state.
One. Right?
Yeah,
if you're not registered to vote, you can't ask for an absentee ballot. This is step one.
That's right. And, you need to know your exact name. It's funny, my registered name, it was my married name plus my legal name plus an initial. It was complicated. And when I first checked for just my legal maiden name, which I thought that wasn't there, and I almost had a heart attack. But I finally figured out what it is. This was some years ago. And it tells me how I'm registered. And in some states, it'll say active or inactive. And if you see inactive, then that's going to cause problems for you. So it's early. Call your county registrar, and there will be numbers. We did a website, 2020voterscalendar.org, and it has links to every state and county. So you can actually call your county now and go, I'm inactive, and I don't want to be. How do I get active? And you need to do that because what you see on your registration form is how the county knows to get in touch with you or not to get in touch with you. And I'm also asking people, take a screenshot with your phone or computer once you see your registration is correct. Because in case there's any purging later on, that'll be evidence that it wasn't your fault. Something happened to the voter rolls. And these days we need evidence for everything.
Right.
So take a screenshot of your registration.
So tell me about this website that you were just talking about. Did PDA have something to do with this, or is this just a standalone website that you like?
Well, we had something to do with it in that members, me and Alan Minsky, who's our executive director, we thought we needed it. And Steve Rosenfeld is a journalist who was doing really good detail work down to the county level. So I know Steve, and I got in touch with him, and I said, let's put some of your research up, and I'm going to do an article. Alan's going to contribute. We have 3 articles there that describe the difficulties that voters face in trying to vote, and some of them are hidden rules, something called the surrender rule. How about where to drop off your voted mail ballot? I want to be specific. You can't always drop it off at the election day polling place. A lot of states won't take it. They need you to drop it off earlier, but by election day, they only want to deal with the at-poll votes. And unless you take it right to your county board of elections by 3 p.m. or 5 p.m., 7 or 8 p.m., I've seen it different in every state, they will not accept your voted mail ballot because it comes too late. You have to either send it through the mail with a postmark by election day, and some people don't want to do that. I get it. So they need to drop it off in person. And if you don't have a drop box, you got to go right to your county election office. And by the way, at 2020 Voters Calendar, we have the addresses of your county elections office. But don't rely on dropping it off at the polling place on election day. You might be wrong. And then you'll have to turn around and take it to the county elections office and hope it's not one of the states where it needs to be in by 3 p.m. So an early voting site is probably okay. Again, check your local rules in 2020voterscalendar.org. We'll give you county links to check all that.
2020voterscalendar.org, a product of Progressive Democrats of America. That's absolutely great, Mimi. What did you think of last night's convention?
I loved it. I really loved it. I was so happy to see our leadership reflecting how I feel and what I want. I mean, it's not policy. We have a lot of work to do, but my God, to see the leadership speak and to see Bernie speak and Michelle Obama. And you know what? I wept during the Rising. Sorry, but that got me. And during Bernie's campaign, remember the America, we're all up to look for America in 2016, his primary video with Simon and Garfunkel, Paul Simon. But this one got me, Bruce Springsteen's The Rising, and all those marches and the people, and it just made me remember what's happening. This is exciting. We have to save the planet. You know, we're running out of oxygen. California's burning. That there's hope.
There is hope. There is, and you know, there's an extraordinary opportunity if more people will get active. That website again, Mimi.
2020voterscalendar.org.
Voter, V-O-T-E-R, or with an S?
Voters, all of us, plural.
With an S. Okay, Voters Calendar. Thank you. Mimi Kennedy.
Thanks, Tom.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Here's how I feel about the value.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are Raycon Earbuds. Stay at home with better sound. More info at buyraycon.com/Tom. Omega XL, which according to clinical research helps joints. More info at omegaxl.com/Tom. CB Distillery, CBD for sleeping. More info at cbdistillery.com, code TOM. The Clean Phone Pro, phone sanitizer and charger. More info at thenewdealshop.com. Keeps hair loss treatment. More info at keeps.com/Tom. And Teeth, Smarter Pet Dental Health. For more info, teeth.com, code TOM.
We say fight back!
Our book today is Jailbreak Out of History by Butch Lee. This is from the first chapter, Jailbreak Out of History, Harriet. Focus on Amazons, about why we deal with real women as myths, girls who never really existed. Yet and again, all are around us, and that we can't bring ourselves to see. Because seeing through white men's eyes is about non-vision of ourselves. So let's deal with a real Amazon. Think about Harriet Tubman. Take 6 months. In fact, take a year and think. Break it on down. What does it mean to be the most famous new African woman in U.S. history? What does it mean to be stuck in that lie? What's the meaning of being famous while being hidden and disfigured and dissed? Let's jailbreak Harriet Tubman out of white history and place her in Amazon and new African her story. her story, her people's story. Harriet Tubman's life is a live weapon placed in our minds, showing us what it means to be an Amazon, which is why the capitalist patriarchy has forbidden us to touch on it for so long. In this, maybe for the first time, we can see Amazons as a future force in a clash of peoples and nations, not as myths, but as players in the whole difficult course of world politics. We can also appreciate the bittersweet tang of reality as the peeling away of layers of propaganda and disfigurement which have hidden Harriet from us exposes how much we assume and how little we have known. New African women have already pointed out the significant pattern of Harriet's exclusion. Cultural critic Bell Hooks said recently, I mean, if we could recover Ida B. Wells and Harriet Tubman to the extent that we've recovered, say, Zora Neale Hurston, I think that's an important contrast because people want to bury that revolutionary black female history. Historian Deborah Gray White connects Harriet's treatment to a larger pattern in the mainstream history of slavery, in which black women, quote, were reduced to insignificance and largely ignored, end quote. In examining the influential historian Stanley Elkins, she points out, quote, that Elkins seems to omit women altogether was accentuated by his description of slaves whom he identified as part of an American underground, those who never succumbed to Samboism. Among those mentioned were Gabriel, who led the revolt of 1820, Denmark Vesey, leading spirit of the 1822 plot at Charleston, and Nat Turner, an omission conspicuous by its absence, was Harriet Tubman. If Elkins had really been thinking of slaves of both sexes, he would hardly have forgotten this woman, who became widely known as the Moses of her people, end of quote. Patriarchal capitalisms, which only want Amazons to be exotic myths about forgotten ages, have hidden Harriet Tubman in her own fame. They both trivialize and exceptionalize her. These are tools of oppressor culture. The stripped down and censored version of her life is told in elementary schools all over the U.S. empire. So much so that everyone thinks they know her story already, although they don't. Harriet Tubman was born in slavery in Maryland around 1820. She escaped to the North when she was 29, but kept returning secretly to the South again and again to help other slaves escape. For this, she became known as Moses. True statements. But by limiting her, it becomes clever propaganda against her and against her people. Where patriarchy has been unable to deny that women do significant things, it denies the full meaning of what we do by trivializing them. Mary Daly, feminist philosopher, traces the enormity of what patriarchy has done to us. In ancient Greece, the goddess Hecate, also known as Artemis and Diana, was sometimes known as Trivia and represented by a three-faced statue. That was also the name used for the intersection of three paths, which in many old cultures were the sites of mystical power. She writes in Gynecology, quote, in light of the cosmic significance of the term trivia as the crossing of the three roads and of the goddess who bears this name, contemporary meaning of the term in English should be examined. The English term, which according to Merriam-Webster is derived from the Latin trivium or crossroads, is defined as common, ordinary, commonplace, of little worth or importance, insignificant, flimsy, minor, or slight. Of course, according to patriarchal values, that which is commonplace is of little worth. For in a competitive hierarchical society, scarcity is intrinsic to worth. Thus, gold is more important than fresh air, and consequently, we are forced to live in a world in which gold is easier to find than pure air. End quote. So to trivialize Harriet Tubman, the capitalist patriarchy pictures her as an idealized woman by their definition, who makes a life of helping others. Thus, her deeds are squeezed into women's assigned maternal role as nurturer, helper, and rescuer of men, who then go on to do important things. But Harriet wasn't repping Mother Teresa. She wasn't even any kind of civilian at all. She was a combatant, a guerrilla, a warrior carrying pistol and rifle, fighting in her people's long war for freedom, a war that rocked the foundations of American society, and that has never gone away. Think about what it means to be called Moses, which was the code name other new Africans gave her, and which became Harriet's famous warrior name in the anti-slavery underground. When we check out the Bible, we can see that Moses was a ruthless visionary, someone who forced the boldest changes and risks upon his people so that they could survive, who led them out of captivity. To put it simply, Moses was a leader in a time of war. So too was Harriet Tubman. The book Jailbreak Out of History by Butch Lee. Beneath it, the book Let the People Pick the President by Jesse Wegman.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. There is one guy whose opinions I pay very, very careful attention to when it comes to everything from nutrition to food safety to public health issues. That's Dr. Michael Greger. He runs a website called nutritionfacts.org. I've played fragments of clips from his very short 2, 3, 4 minute YouTube pieces many, many times over the years. I have learned so much from Dr. Greger, and I'm constantly promoting his work. He's got a new book out in paperback. It's called How to Survive a Pandemic. The Twitter handle is nutrition_facts, and as I said, the website is nutritionfacts.org. And sure enough, Dr. Michael Greger is here with us. If we can make our phones work, Dr. Greger, welcome back to the program. It's been a while. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I miss being there in studio.
Yeah, it's great having you with us. So tell us about the relationship between animal-borne diseases generally and COVID-19 and this pandemic that we're experiencing right now.
You know, over the last few decades, hundreds of human pathogens have emerged at a rate unprecedented in human history. You say, wait a second, emerged from where? Mostly from animals. The AIDS virus is blamed on the butchering of primates and the bushmeat trade in Africa. Mad cow disease was because we turned cows into carnivores and cannibals. SARS and COVID-19 have been traced back to the exotic wild animal trade. You know, but our last pandemic, swine flu in 2009, arose not from some backwater wet market in Asia, but was largely made in the USA on pig operations in the United States. Now, thankfully, swine flu only killed about 500,000 people, but the next time, we might not be so lucky.
So most of the diseases that we're struggling with, and I know, some of the older diseases, smallpox, tuberculosis, syphilis, gonorrhea, they all go back to animals as well. I mean, we've had this long-standing relationship with these, is it zoonotic or zoonotic diseases for centuries, for millennia. First of all, why do they spread so efficiently in human populations? And secondly, what human behavior is it that keeps producing these plagues?
Well, the spread is thanks to the fact that people are becoming infectious, contagious before they start showing symptoms, which makes it very difficult to tamp down. But in terms of what we're doing, when we overcrowd thousands of animals in these cramped, filthy football field-sized sheds in these factory farms to lie, beak to beak or snout to snout atop their own waste, it's just a breeding ground for disease. I mean, the sheer number of animals, the overcrowding, the stress crippling their immune systems, the ammonia from the decomposing waste burning their lungs, lack of fresh air, lack of sunlight, put all these factors together. What you really have is kind of a perfect storm environment for the emergence and spread of these so-called super strains of influenza. The bottom line is that it's not worth risking the lives of millions of people for the sake of cheaper chicken.
So how if Americans, by and large, stopped eating animal products, and thus substantially reduced the demand for factory farms and industrial meat operations and bushmeat for that matter. If we were to do that, would that help reduce the probability of future zoonotic, animal-caused disease epidemics like the one we're experiencing right now, which came out of bats? Number one, would it reduce that? And number two, would Americans or humans survive eating a diet that does not include animal products at all?
In this new age of emerging diseases, we now have billions of feathered and curly-tailed test tubes for viruses to incubate and mutate within, billions more spins at pandemic roulette. So the smaller we can make those numbers, the lower the risk may be. And in terms of can we eat plant-based, in fact, look at it. I mean, not only could we, it would reduce our risk not only of chronic diseases like heart disease, but reduce the underlying risk factors for the current pandemic's severity and death. Obesity, heart disease, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes. These are the predisposing factors that are increasing people's risk right now, all of which can be controlled or even reversed with a healthy enough plant-based diet and lifestyle.
So if people renounce all animal products, including, cheese, eggs, milk, as well as, flesh foods, you're saying that they get healthier always?
Of course, it depends what you replace it with, right? Some of the worst foods on the planet are technically plant-based. Soda is plant-based. Potato chips are plant-based. But so I encourage people to move towards whole food plant-based diets, centering their diets around the healthiest foods out there: fruits, vegetables, legumes, which are beans, split peas, chickpeas, lentils, whole grains, nuts and seeds, mushrooms, herbs, and spices. Basically, real food that grows out of the ground from fields, not factories. Those are our healthiest choices.
Yeah. Now, I don't want to suggest that becoming a vegan is going to save you from COVID or coronavirus, and I know you're not suggesting that either. We're having this conversation in the context of how do we stop the next pandemic, the next time this kind of thing breaks down or goes nuts. Is there any evidence that diet is associated with risk factors for getting severely ill with COVID-19?
Well, I mean, look, you don't even have to be obese. Just having a BMI of 28 or more, which is about 175 pounds of the average American height, puts you at nearly 6 times the odds of suffering a severe COVID-19 course. And in the United States, the average BMI exceeds 29. So even being skinnier than the average American, you can have so much excess body fat still put you at extremely high risk for suffering a severe course. So, putting in place healthier habits right now, protecting in the future against chronic diseases, and right now against the infectious disease threat.
Yeah. Tell me about mTOR and how some of these animal products trigger, actions in the body that might not be useful or healthy for us long term.
Oh, well, yeah. So mTOR is kind of the engine of aging enzyme. In fact, that's the subject of my next book, How Not to Age, which will be out December 22, 2022. But mTOR is there are certain amino acids that are concentrated in animal protein, which accelerate the aging process. It can increase our risk of diseases associated with old age, such as cancer and heart disease. And we can reduce our intake of those specific amino acids by shifting over to plant protein, which has as an additional bonus not the baggage associated with protein from animal sources, such as the saturated fat and the cholesterol and the hormones, etc. So since food is a package deal, we can get our nutrients from healthier sources, predominantly from the produce aisle. But plant foods in general, eating at the bottom of the food chain reduces our exposure to industrial pollutants. It has a number of side benefits beyond just the chronic diseases that are laying waste to the American public.
Yeah, we just have 45 seconds left. What's your best advice for Americans to just more broadly stay healthy, in these difficult times?
Oh, well, we should really take this opportunity to, get sufficient sleep, keep active, reduce stress, stay connected, albeit remotely, to friends and family, eating a healthy diet. These are, if you ever want to start a meditation practice or start an exercise program, really clean out the cupboards, let's all take this time to set the healthier habits, which will not only protect us and our families in the future against chronic disease, now against infections, but also prevent future infections as well.
Yeah, view it as an opportunity. Dr. Michael Greger, MD, physician, author, internationally recognized speaker on nutrition, food safety, and public health issues. His new book, How to Survive a Pandemic, nutritionfacts.org, nutrition_facts. The book is available wherever you find fine books. Dr. Greger, thanks so much for being with us today.
Keep up the great work.
Thanks. Thanks, you too. We'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with more of the news of the day right after this. Stick around. And welcome back. Let's try this again. Our phones were not working earlier, but we just had a conversation with Dr. Greger, and it didn't break up terribly badly. We think that we've isolated the problem, by the way, for those of you, techies out there. Our internet provider had a massive loss of service the other day, and apparently when they reset it, they didn't do it in a way that was compatible with our phone system. So Dave, our head engineer, is working on that right now. But let's try this out and see how it works. Leo in Portland. Hey, Leo, what's on your mind today? Thanks for watching Free Speech TV.
Hi, Tom. I just wanted to congratulate you as one of the few people in media that is actually bringing out Trump's mental illness and calling it what it is, instead of just reporting on the ridiculous things he says. I thought that he was a con man back from the beginning. I knew he was going to be president when he said that, when he conned everybody that he's a billionaire and said, well, I'll just finance my, go on as an independent and finance this all myself if I'm not treated well. And ever since then, he's been conning people and saying the most absurd, crazy things, and nobody aside from you calls it what it is just in crazy mental illness.
Yeah, and it raises an interesting question. I mean, Trump is clearly a grifter. He has spent his entire life being a grifter, being a con man. But it raises the question: does it require mental illness? Does mental illness, the type of mental illness he has, narcissistic personality disorder, and among other things, and sociopathy, does that cause people to become con men and grifters, or do people who decide to become con men and grifters only succeed at it if they are sociopaths because they can, rationalize their awful behavior and the way that they're treating people? What do you think?
Interesting question. Yeah.
Which is chicken, which is egg, right?
The Republican Party, that he would just split the vote and go off and do his own thing, his own campaign. I thought right then, I'm like, oh, I hope he can't, threaten these guys and intimidate them into giving him the nomination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It is extraordinary. Leo, thanks for the call. It's great to hear from you. Freda in Bella Vista, Arkansas. Hey, Freda, what's on your mind today?
Oh, Tom. Okay, so much. First of all, I just wanted to ask you if you have paid attention to the poison pouring out of this man. And lately, he has repeated several times over that he's the chosen one. And he's been, he thinks he's been sent by God. And the point,
I don't think he believes in God, Freda.
No, he's using that to keep attached to him all of the evangelical people who really believe that kind of stuff. And it's just, there's no way to convince them. Also, I live in Arkansas, and I want you to know that I have been following Tom Cotton. He is an even bigger monster, and we have to really watch out for him. Yeah,
he's the one I worry about. He's your senator from Arkansas, Tom Cotton?
Yes, he is.
Yeah, okay. Freda, thank you, and my sympathies. We'll be right back. Daily rants and weekly op-eds at HartmannReport.com. It's free and there's no ads. HartmannReport.com. So what if Donald Trump loses the election and decides that he's going to punish America for not being sufficiently loyal to him, for not loving him, for not re-electing him? And so he has, Jerome Powell, his hand-picked successor to the, as the new chair of the Fed, who has created $7 trillion out of thin air and used much of it to buy stocks and bonds to prop up the bond market. That's 1/3 of the entire nation's entire annual gross domestic product. What if he orders Powell to stop supporting the stock and bond markets between November 3rd and January 20th? the bottom would fall out of the market. The bottom would fall out of the housing market as well, particularly if inflation started going up, which Powell has already indicated he's going to let happen. And the country would be thrown into something worse than the Republican Great Depression of the 1930s. Is it possible? Well, we've got a video talking about that for the supporters of our program over at ThomHartmann.com. All right, there's a lot in the news today, and I just wanted to get back to some of these things. In Oklahoma, for example, the school started this week, and so you've got teenagers who either are not paying attention to the news, and I'd say this is true of their parents as well. Obviously, the decision to send a kid off to school after he has tested positive for COVID is probably a decision that was made not just by the kid, but by the entire family. But in Oklahoma, they have just shut down the Moore public schools because, as Information Officer Dawn Jones told the local TV station KFOR, this teenager who had a positive COVID test thought because he didn't have symptoms, he could go to school. Let that sink in. When you are positive and you don't yet have symptoms, that's the period when you are maximally infectious. It's absolutely extraordinary. Whoa, I'm sorry. Kathleen Kennedy, I totally missed this, my cue on this. Oh, Kathleen Kennedy Townsend is on the line with us. Kathleen is the retirement security advocate, attorney and professor at Georgetown University, former lieutenant governor of Maryland, in fact, the first woman to hold that office. 2020 DNC delegate for Joe Biden, also the eldest child of Robert F. Kennedy. Democrats.org is the website. Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, welcome back to the program. It's been a while since you've been here. I'm curious your take on how the convention went last night and what you're expecting tonight.
Well, I think I have to give Tom Perez a shout out, because I think it's very difficult to put on a convention without the cheers that we're accustomed to, but I think he did a really, really good job showing how much support there is for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris across the board, whether you're, a Republican or a Democrat, conservative or liberal. You're saying this is the team we want to be the next president, vice president of our country, because we believe that we would in the rule of law, we believe in opportunity for all, and we believe that America has better days ahead when we can trust one another, can have faith in one another, and can have empathy for one another. And I think that message came across loud and clear last night.
I remember the 1964 election. I went door to door. I was 13 with my dad for Barry Goldwater. And the hit on Barry Goldwater was that he was going to cause a nuclear war, the Daisy ad and all that kind of thing. I remember the 1980 election with Ronald Reagan. I was convinced, within 3 years of going door to door with my dad for Barry Goldwater, I was out in East Lansing getting gassed in anti-war demonstrations. But I also remember 1980 where the warning from Democrats was that Ronald Reagan, or some folks were, and I was among them, were concerned that Ronald Reagan was crazy and might start World War III. But never in my lifetime, and I don't think in the history of the country, you go back to the XYZ affair during the John Adams presidency, I don't think that there has ever been a time in our country where there was not just a conversation about, but serious evidence all over the place, like we saw in this Intelligence Committee report this morning, that the President of the United States is actively working in the interests of another nation than the United States, that he has betrayed his country. This is mind-boggling.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you know, some of us have suspected that for quite a long time. And certainly, I think we've seen it with the COVID outbreak. We didn't see much care for our country or care for our citizens. But the fact that the chair of his campaign was so closely intertwined with the counterintelligence of the Russians is just so mind-boggling, so sad, so disgusting. I don't really have words for it. And that this report was put out by the Republicans.
That's right. Yeah, they control the Senate Intelligence Committee, which raises the question.
The Senate Intelligence. So they're putting this out. I mean, they didn't have to put this out, and they're putting it out. So this is saying something pretty. This is saying something quite stunning about what they think of the head of their party.
Which raises the question, and we just have a minute left before we hit a hard break here. You know, you've got John Kasich and other Republicans reaching out and saying yes. Do you think that we can put this country back together if enough people pull together?
Absolutely. I think this is a very strong country. I mean, we did have a civil war, and then we did come back together. People were killed. They killed, as you know, more than 500,000 people in a much smaller part of our population, and we came back together. It took a while. Some people would say we're still fighting over Confederate monuments, but we haven't had a war, and I think we're much more able to come back together now.
Yeah, from your lips to God's ears. Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, Democrats.org, the DNC website, KKT_Kennedy is her Twitter handle. Kathleen, thank you so much for being with us. I should say, Lieutenant Governor Townsend, thank you so much for being with us today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Take good care. Bye.
Yeah, thanks. You too. We'll be right back with more of the news of the day and your calls after this. It's coming up on 28 minutes.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Stick around. We'll be right back. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment by yours truly. This is from Chapter 1, The Unholy Alliance of Racism, Genocide, and Guns. In Isaiah 14:21, the Lord tells Isaiah, "Prepare for his sons a place of slaughter because of the iniquity of their fathers." It's a variation on the old story of karma and seems in a very real way to be playing out today in the United States. America is facing an epidemic. Public health officials use that word of gun-related suicides, accidents, and even homicides and police killings. That epidemic has grown worse in the past decade, largely because the number of guns in America has increased, in large part because of the racial fears of white men who have bought guns in record numbers for 8 years during the time in office of America's first black president. A landmark 1999 study from researchers Franklin Zimring and Gordon Hawkins showed that the main correlation, far surpassing mental illness, socioeconomic status, or race, that could be defined as causal in predicting the rates of gun deaths is a simple number, the number of guns distributed among society. In the 30 years since that study, Zimring and Hawkins' results have been replicated and reanalyzed dozens of times. As the American Academy of Pediatrics said in a release published in AAAS's Science magazine, quote, "New research shows dramatic differences in the number of children hospitalized and killed each year in the U.S. from firearm-related injuries based on their state's gun legislation, even after adjusting for poverty, unemployment, and education rates. It found twice as many pediatric firearm deaths in states with the most lenient gun regulations compared to states where gun laws are strictest," end quote. They added that this is a critical issue for children, quoting Stephanie Cho, MD, the lead author of the abstract, quote, "Firearm-related injuries are the second leading cause of death among children in the United States. But we found a clear discrepancy in where those deaths happen that corresponds with the strengths of states' firearm legislation. In states with lenient laws, children die at alarmingly greater rates," end quote. And unsurprisingly, America not only has unusually lenient gun laws, but also has more guns in civilian hands than any other country in the world. America has a bit more than 4% of the world's population, but holds almost 50% of all the guns in civilian hands worldwide, more than 390 million guns. And the more guns a society has, the more gun deaths it will experience. The NRA and their army of lobbyists have been quite successful in making this happen.
During Obama's presidency, there was a steady and hysterical drumbeat of articles, emails, and political proclamations by so-called pro-gun politicians and think tanks, suggesting that Obama was preparing to take away everyone's guns at any minute. There was even a subtext embraced by the hard right that he wasn't going to stop there. After disarming white Americans, these folks said, Obama was going to intern them in otherwise unused FEMA camps. Flipped-out gun owners were repeatedly arrested during the Obama years trying to break into retired or temporarily vacant military facilities and toxic waste sites, looking for evidence to prove that Obama was, in fact, preparing the modern-day version of the World War II-era Japanese internment camps. White supremacy was the founding notion of this nation. White Europeans thought themselves so superior to the human beings they met here in 1492 that Columbus himself became the first North American slaver, shipping Taino Indians back to Spain as slaves to the royal family. A slave is as good as gold, Columbus wrote for the king and queen. Europeans in the Americas then stepped up that game into a hemisphere-wide campaign of racial genocide, pulling off the largest multi-generational mass murder in the history of the world. In the midst of that effort, they also created the legal mechanisms necessary to define and legally regulate slavery, and even built those systems into America's founding document, the Constitution. America was birthed in slavery and genocide, and both needed guns. It was the superior weaponry of guns that gave the European settlers a massive advantage over the bow and arrow-equipped Native Americans, and it was the raw power of widespread white ownership of guns in the South that propped up the institution of slavery for hundreds of years. Without guns, neither would have been possible, or at least neither would have been as easy as they were to pull off. And now, after centuries of guns being used to kill off and keep down people of color in America, those same guns are creating a terrifying epidemic of gun-facilitated violence, from public schools to private homes and public concerts. It's enough to make one think that Isaiah was onto something. Chapter 2, The Sanitized History of America. The United States' expansion and conquest in the late 18th century through the 19th century and into the 20th century is a history written by white men, inked in the blood of Native Americans, and built on the broken and bloody backs of enslaved people brought here from Africa. From 1791, when the Bill of Rights went into effect, until the end of the Civil War, the Second Amendment protected the rights only of white men to own guns. This is simply because until the ratification of the 14th Amendment, states determined who was recognized as a person protected under the Constitution. Initially, in most states, that meant that white men who owned land and paid taxes were the only people considered full citizens under the Constitution. In the South, white men with guns formed slave patrols to control slaves and formed posses to hunt escaped slaves. The book, The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment.
Coming up on the Science Revolution, Noah Greenwald from the Center for Biological Diversity is here on Trump's latest actions to weaken the Endangered Species Act. You know, as we destroy the wild, we destroy ourselves. Dr. Justin A. Frank, MD, drops by and says it is terrifying to have a president who is psychotic and explains why Trump hates anyone who is loved. Former Assistant Secretary for Health under Obama, Dr. Howard Koh, tells us how Biden will handle this pandemic we're in. And lastly, in geeky science, we find out how our bones are made of stars. The Science Revolution, wherever fine podcasts are available. My new book, The Hidden History of Monopolies, How Big Business Destroyed the American Dream. I'll be taking you from the birth of America as a revolt against monopoly, remember the Boston Tea Party, to the largely successful efforts of both Presidents Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt and other like-minded leaders to constrain corporations' monopolistic urges, to the massive changes in the rules of business starting during the Reagan Revolution that have brought us into the cancer stage of capitalism. In the foreword by Ralph Nader, he says, "This is the most important dynamic book on the cancers of monopoly by giant corporations written in our generation." End quote. It's the fourth in my Hidden History series, available where all fine books are sold. And don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. Democracy starts with you. Tag, you're it. You can check it out over there. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Okay, I started out talking about this Oklahoma teen who tested because he just doesn't know what's going on. Meanwhile, in Texas, it looks like all of the information that people have has just gone to hell. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. Last week, Texas hit the grim milestone of 10,000 people dead from coronavirus. Now, if you had 10,000 people in one state who were dead from, say, some, terrorist incident, I mean, this is 3 times the number of people who died in 9/11. If you had 10,000 people dead from that, we would that produced 1/3 of that produced the Department of Homeland Security and the Patriot Act. If you had 10,000 people dead from mass shootings, we'd have gun control. If you had 10,000 people dead from some guy saying he represented Antifa, you'd have a national crackdown. But Texas, This is from the Daily Beast. It's by Olivia Messer. She says, last week, Texas hit the grim milestone of 10,000 COVID deaths. That is, it did if you went by local news outlets or the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center. But the Texas Department of State Health Services didn't report a similar figure until around 5 p.m. on Monday. That's a week later. The state, she notes, has endured weeks of data woes, sowing distrust across Texas. State officials have blamed coding errors, system upgrades, backlogs. Right. So here, these are the excuses that Texas is giving. I think that you and I both know that all these excuses are complete BS. Just like, Donald Trump handing off to a private for-profit corporation all the data on the coronavirus. The same thing, right? And which is, by the way, let me just digress for a moment. This is at the federal level. Teletracking Technologies is a company that is owned by one very, very rich guy who may well be, I haven't seen specific evidence, but I'm seeing people all over the place talking about it, may well be a major Trump donor. He got a no-bid contract to take over the database of COVID information in hospitals from the CDC. And when the Senate subpoenaed him and said, we would like to talk to you, we would like to ask you questions about this giant multi-million-dollar no-bid contract and why it is that the CDC used to report this information on a same-day basis, and you're not. You're basically burying this information. We'd like to know what the hell's going on. And his response was, I can't tell you anything because I signed a non-disclosure agreement with Health and Human Services. Trump doesn't just have porn stars and Playboy bunnies with whom he's had sex sign non-disclosure agreements. He doesn't just have corrupt lawyers who cut deals with foreign oligarchs sign non-disclosure agreements. He apparently is having private for-profit corporations, in this case Teletracking Technologies, to which he has outsourced all of our information and news about the coronavirus. He has them sign non-disclosure agreements. And they're using this to say, therefore, we can't talk to the United States Senate, who appropriated the damn $10 million that is being given to them. I mean, this is wrong on so many levels. This all happened back in July when Donald Trump announced that he was no longer going to have this information from hospitals go to the CDC, where it's gone for decades. The CDC has this. They've got it figured out. They got a website. They distribute the information. It's how hospitals know how to plan for what's coming down the road. All this kind of stuff. He took it all away from the CDC and gave it to, a crony. The guy's name is Michael Zamagias, Zamagias, who owns Teletracking, and he is a Pittsburgh real estate developer. Think about that for a minute. Our coronavirus information at a national level is no longer available to us and is scrambled since July, since last month, because a real estate developer from Pittsburgh has been given a no-bid contract to handle that data. Honest to God, not making this up. This is from the friggin' New York Times. The headline, the manager of the Trump administration's new virus database refuses Senate questioning, citing a non-disclosure agreement. The private healthcare technology vendor refused to answer questions from top Senate Democrats about its $10.2 million contract, saying it signed a non-disclosure agreement with the Federal Department of HHS, of Health and Human Services. A spokeswoman for the Department of Health and Human Services said members of Congress should direct their inquiries to the government, not the company. But Senator Patty Murray of Washington, the top Democrat on the Senate Health Committee, sent a letter to the agency in June seeking similar information and has not received a reply. You get this? So Alex Azar, the guy who doubled the price of insulin when he was running Eli Lilly, he now runs our Health and Human Services Department. He's saying to the Senate, if you want to know about this private contract with teletracking services and the Pittsburgh real estate developer, multimillionaire guy who owns it, if you want to, that has deep sixed and buried our coronavirus information, and you want to know about that, ask us, ask the government agency. So Senator Murray reaches out to them and says, yeah, we'd like to ask you about it. And they don't answer her emails or her letters, excuse me. Now, maybe it's stuck in the mail, right? No, I say that facetiously. No answer. So then they reach out to the company itself and say, we'd like you to tell us. The company says, no, I can't tell you because I signed a confidentiality agreement. This is the Trump administration saying, screw you to every American. This is Donald Trump telling us that he doesn't give a rat's ass about the health of Americans. He doesn't care about Americans who are dying from COVID. He doesn't care about young Americans, people in the 20s, 30s, and 40s who are getting COVID, and 80% of them having long-lasting heart damage. New study out. We can get to that a little later on the program. He doesn't care about that. He doesn't care about any of this stuff. He just cares about creating enough chaos that people will be afraid to go vote unless they happen to live in the Fox bubble where they think that it's just the flu. And, which brings us back to the statistic that, I'll quote it. Among those who say they will vote by mail, 81% support Biden, 14% support Trump. So let's blow up the post office. I mean, this is evil. And now it's happening in Texas too. And do you think that Greg Abbott is just like, first when the question was asked, okay, Texas, why is it that we can't get this information? And they said, oh, well, we've had coding errors. Well, then the coding errors were solved, and there's still no information. So why is it that we now can't get the information? And then they said, well, we're having system upgrades. And then after the system upgrades were done, well, can we get the information now? No, I'm sorry, we've got backlogs, presumably caused by the coding errors and the system upgrades. So we wait and we wait and we say, how about now? And they say, well, we've had a change in methodology, so we're handling the data differently. So that old data will never be available, and the new data, we've got to run it through a whole new process, and I'm sorry, it's just going to take some time. And then finally, people said, well, okay, you've had a few weeks to do that. What's your excuse now? And the new excuse is that the federal government, the Donald Trump administration, closed some of the testing centers. Honest to God, this is what the Abbott administration is telling the citizens of Texas. Olivia Messer reporting about it over at the Daily Beast. The Vice Chancellor for Health Affairs at the University of Texas System and a member of the Texas Medical Association COVID Task Force, Dr. David Lakey, said, and I quote, "It's not making sense." Gee, you think? Lakey said, all of a sudden it looked like death skyrocketed. Well, that's because they were lying to us about what was happening before they could no longer cover it up. Mind-boggling. We'll be back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And don't get me started on what America's super rich are doing. Actually, maybe I'll start on that after the break. Stick with me. And welcome back. Hang on just a second. I'm just trying to clean up something on our one sheet, and let's pick up your phone calls. Where did we go? There we are. Dr. Lynn in Los Angeles. Hey, Dr. Lynn, what's up?
I'm calling because in order to get votes back, I know that for me, I hesitate sometimes because I don't know things like judges and a lot of these local issues. So I look for a progressive voter slate, and I never can find any. So I'll go on like the National Nurses Association to see some of their recommendations, or the teachers unions. But I mean, I think, like, in fact, for judges, I go on conservative slates, and then I vote against whoever they recommend. But I think that we really need voter slates that are local. And I was hoping you could talk to some progressive Democrats, you know, that have, you know, in government that could maybe, you know, initiate something like that.
That's an excellent point, Dr. Lynn. Here in Portland, I know that Louise and I, the thing that slowed us down a lot the last time we voted, or the next to the last time we voted, the last one was just a local city council election, voted by mail, by the way, was the judges. And we had to do some considerable research on the internet to track down who these people were who were running for Congress and everything. So thank you for that. I will see what I can do with that. I appreciate the call. Mark in Tacoma Park, Maryland. Hey, Mark, what's up? Thanks for watching us on Facebook Live.
You know, I actually want to follow up on your previous caller, because I was thinking that our man-child president is affecting the ballots for the entire country. His name is not the only one on the ballot. There are governors, school board members, controllers. And just because we not vote the Republican president doesn't mean that we won't vote for Republicans something else. So he's affecting their...
Well, this is the problem, Mark. I mean, this is what Trump is thinking, and this is why the Republicans in the Senate are not speaking out against him, because they hope to benefit from his strategy. They're going to let him do the dirty work and let him take all the blame for it. And, you know, people like Tom Cotton and Tom Tillis and all these, you know, Joni Ernst, Susan Collins, Mitch McConnell, they are all hoping that Democrats will be afraid to show up and vote and won't be able to vote by mail, or if they do vote by mail, it'll arrive so late it won't be counted, whereas Republicans who watch Fox News and believe that the coronavirus is just a flu will show up at the polls. And they don't care if they die 3 weeks later, or it's more like 6 or 8 or 10 weeks later. They don't care if they die a few weeks later, as long as they show up at the polls and return these people to power. That's the bottom line, Mark.
Well, that's a bad equation, really.
Yeah.
That's all I have to say.
For democracy and for our country, yes.
Yeah,
but,
exactly.
You know, Trump has made it very clear he doesn't care about people.
Anyway, I just wanted to say that. I appreciate your show. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Well said. And this is, I mean, you know, what Mark talks about is, and Dr. Lynn talks about, are very real issues. We need to have a national, at the very least, national standards for voting. If we can have national standards for education, we have national standards for how hospitals are run, we have national standards for medical practices, you know, we have national standards for radio and television, you know, the technical side of it. We have national standards for the technical side of the internet. Why can't we have national standards for the technical side of voting? It just seems like a very simple and straightforward thing. To have an educated and informed populace, and a populace that has the ability to actually vote. We'll be back. It's 10 minutes before the hour. So. The hidden history of the war on voting tells how the GOP has been stealing elections for decades and will again this year unless we stop them. Hi, Thom Hartmann here. Hey, my new book is out, The Hidden History of Monopolies, How Big Business Destroyed the American Dream. We're having a coronavirus-safe book tour. I'll be at Powell's virtual bookstore event in conversation with David Corton, Tuesday, August 25th at 5 p.m. Pacific time. Go to powells.com and get your tickets for the live stream event. And on Friday, September 4th at 6 p.m. Pacific time, I'll be at a Town Hall Seattle virtual event, and you can get your tickets for that live stream event at townhallseattle.org. There are also links at thomhartmann.com. I'll be taking you from the birth of America through FDR to the Reagan Revolution and today. In the foreword of my book, Ralph Nader says, "This is the most important, dynamic book on the cancers of monopoly by giant corporations written in our generation," end quote. So be sure to go to thomhartmann.com and sign up for one of these two great virtual book signings, Powell's in Portland and Town Hall Seattle. Don't miss it and sign up now. Tag you're it. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. I told you I was going to talk about America's super rich throwing parties and escaping on jets and things amid COVID-19. It's worse than you think. It turns out these people have got instant tests, rapid response tests, a 15-minute test, the ones that they're using in the sports teams, the ones that they use at the White House. Donald Trump made sure that these were not produced by government agencies. They're produced by private for-profit corporations. So anybody who's got the money can get them. And they're not going to our schools. They're not going to our hospitals. They're not going to the military. They're not going to our first responders. They're not going to our frontline workers. They're not going to stores, retail stores, so that they can test their employees every day. They're not going to our schools so that we can test teachers. No, they're being bought up by billionaires so that they can have parties. Not making this up. There's a big article about this in Vanity Fair. And then, a whole bunch of shorter pieces that kind of summarize it. The one I have here in front of me is over at thedailymail.co.uk by Emily Crane. America's super rich are throwing parties where guests are offered 15-minute rapid COVID-19 tests and using their private jets to avoid having to stay in hotspots amid the pandemic. While 1,000 Americans are dying every day, Silicon Valley's elite have been carrying on with their lives and socializing as if everything was normal. A source told Vanity Fair, quote, "All these rich people, they can't stop themselves," said one person who has ties to tech CEOs and venture capitalists. Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg was spotted last month riding a $12,000 electric surfboard during a vacation with his family in Hawaii. Uber co-founder Travis Kalanick is reportedly among those throwing outdoor parties at his $43 million home in Los Angeles. Before you can get in, of course, you've got to do one of these 15-minute tests. Another unnamed billionaire has been throwing lavish parties where guests have to have a 15-minute rapid COVID-19 test before they're allowed inside. Some investors in LA and Silicon Valley are also renting mansions in Palm Springs that cost about $50,000 a month just so they can host parties. Billionaires have also been using their jets to go from COVID-19 safe zones as the outbreak spreads around the country. One investor was in Miami at the beginning of the pandemic before moving to Los Angeles, and then when Los Angeles heated up, he moved to New York, which has now cooled back down again. It's really remarkable. The demand for private jets has skyrocketed amid the pandemic, with inquiries up 195% in June of this year compared to last year, according to NetJets. Some billionaires and multimillionaires are even paying $2.6 million to get citizenship in foreign countries. There's a number of small countries that will sell you citizenship for a few million bucks so that they can leave the United States. Europe will not admit you if you have an American passport. In fact, most countries around the world will not let you come in as an American because America has the worst COVID outbreak in the world. We've got almost 6 million infected people. We've got, we're going on 200,000 dead Americans. Worse than literally any other country in the world. And it's continuing at a rate that is beating every other country in the world. It's insane. And countries won't let us in. So what's happening? Billionaires are buying citizenship in other countries so that they can fly in on their private jets. And how can they afford to do that? Well, from mid-March to mid-May, U.S. billionaires added over $700 billion to their wealth. Almost $1 trillion. This is where we're at. Meanwhile, if you look at American households, This is from Bloomberg.com. Almost a third of people in some states have little or no confidence that they can pay August's rent or mortgage. 1/3. In mid-July, more than a third of New Yorkers experienced housing insecurity. In the Houston area, the figure approached 40%. Housing insecurity means you're almost homeless. 127 million Americans. Keep in mind, there's only 340 million of us. There's only roughly 50 million of us in the workforce. 127 million Americans experienced a loss of income since mid-March. More than half of households have experienced a loss of income since March 13th. Researchers found that pandemic-induced layoffs were responsible for 11.6 million job losses, and another 6.9 million were due to the unavailability of childcare. The total number of people who don't have enough to eat as a result of the pandemic, you've seen these pictures of these mile-long lines to get to food pantries, 23.8 million people for the week ending July 24th, an increase of 6 million from the first week of May. 23.8 million people don't have enough to eat. That includes millions of children. And what is Trump doing about this? Absolutely nothing. He's shutting down the mail. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, in a study conducted in May and June, found that more than 10% of adults seriously considered suicide, a figure that is rose to more than one quarter among 18 to 24-year-olds. They also found a jump in substance abuse and mental health disorders. The Census Bureau found that more than 70 million American adults did not get health care that they needed between mid-June and mid-July because they were afraid of getting COVID if they went to the doctor's office. A lot of people with little problems are going to discover those little problems are big problems a few months down the road because of Trump's incompetence.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
What's the matter with the post office?
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are Raycon earbuds. Stay at home with better sound. More info at buyraycon.com/Tom. Omega XL, which according to clinical research helps joints. More info at omegaxl.com/Tom. CB Distillery, CBD for sleeping. More info at cbdistillery.com, code TOM. The Clean Phone Pro, phone sanitizer and charger. More info at thenewdealshop.com. Keeps hair loss treatment. More info at keeps.com/Tom. And Teeth, Smarter Pet Dental Health. For more info, teeth.com, code TOM.
We say fight back!
For our Thom Hartmann Book Club excerpt today, we're reading from Ed Morales' new book, Fantasy Island, Colonialism, Exploitation, and the Betrayal of Puerto Rico. This is from the first chapter. There was never any doubt that the United States wanted Puerto Rico for its own when it began a war with Spain near the turn of the 20th century. Cuba had been in the throes of independence war with Spain off and on since 1868, and the conflict that began in 1895 seemed ripe for the United States to capitalize on. The sinking of the USS Maine, an American naval ship destroyed by an explosion while moored just outside Havana, fueled American entry into the war. Although there are conflicting theories about the source of the explosion, including the likelihood it was caused by a spontaneous internal fire, William Randolph Hearst's newspaper chain blew up the incident into the perfect catalyst for the United States to enter the conflict. When Theodore Roosevelt entered the fray with his army of Rough Riders, the whole affair came as no surprise to anyone who'd been paying attention to the lust U.S. government leaders and military had long expressed to expand southward and westward. And although the idea of manifest destiny was at the forefront of the political discourse of this period, it's less often observed that the United States' expansionist gaze was saturated with racial language and attitudes, at once desirous of and repelled by Latin America's mestizo mulatto social dynamic. The Haitian Revolution at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th created a U.S. obsession with both Cuba and Puerto Rico because of the potential of a similar black-led revolt on those islands. In 1826, Virginia Senator John Randolph feared that such a revolt would render the southern United States vulnerable to invasion from Cubans in rowboats. For this reason, he objected to the United States participating in the 1826 Panama Congress because American diplomats would have to endure the horror of a U.S. diplomat taking his seat in the Congress, quote, beside the native African, their American descendants, the mixed breeds, the Indians, and the half-breeds, without any offense or scandal at so motley a mixture, end quote. The logic driving this perspective underlined not only the importance of slavery to the emergence of capitalism in the 19th century, but also, as Matthew Karp points out in this vast southern empire, the extent to which slave owners and their elected representatives disproportionately shaped U.S. foreign policy. Going back as far as the Haitian Revolution, fear of a successful slave rebellion in the newly formed United States strongly motivated Southern politicians. As Karp mentions, to that end, Presidents Madison and Monroe, quote, used overwhelming force to destroy black maroon settlements in southern Florida, end quote. Fear of slave rebellions also briefly united the interests of American slaveholders and Cuban elites who wanted independence from Spain, but in the late 19th century, after abolition, Roosevelt's forces fought in conjunction with Afro-Cuban armies against their common Spanish foe. The move to wrest Cuba and Puerto Rico from Spain came just as Spain had finally relented to end slavery as a concession to black rebel Cuban armies that had formed to push for independence. In a further move to placate continued unrest on the island, in November 1897, Spain signed automatic charters for Cuba and Puerto Rico, which gave limited home rule governments to both islands. Puerto Rico would gain full representation in the Cortes, the Spanish parliament, and could veto Spanish commercial treaties unfavorable to them while also retaining the rights to set tariffs on imports and exports. In this way, Puerto Ricans were granted a kind of citizenship that allowed self-government grafted on what was left of their Spanish subjecthood. Yet on July 25, 1898, 8 days after the first meeting of the newly formed Puerto Rican Parliament, U.S. troops arrived in the southern port of Guanica and replaced the Spanish flag with the stars and stripes. This date would be remembered over 50 years later when the United States finally followed through on a project to allow Puerto Ricans to have limited autonomy and self-government. But at the time, it was both the end of Teddy Roosevelt's splendid little war and the beginning of the current quandary over what exactly Puerto Rico's new colonial master would do with the island. Although historians agree that there was no pre-existing plan for designating Puerto Rico's status, there was a general belief that Puerto Rico could be incorporated as a U.S. territory and probably would be. This led many to assume that it would follow a similar path to statehood as former territories like Florida and Louisiana. At the very least, it would, by acceding to military control, receive, quote, the advantages and blessings of enlightened civilization, end quote, as Puerto Rico's first military governor, Nelson A. Miles, declared 3 days after the landing of Guanica. Because Cuba was so militarized during its wars for independence, the United States decided to allow it national sovereignty, thinking it could still exert considerable control over the economy because of existing business interests and a ready-made set of Cuban consumers who were already buying Ford Model Ts. But although Puerto Rico had experienced anti-Spanish uprisings in the mid-19th century, in 1898 they did not have nearly the same level of armed mobilization present. So the United States held on to it, particularly because of its geographic location, which would provide the United States with a stronghold on the easternmost tip of the Caribbean. The book is Fantasy Island by Ed Morales. His victory represented a certain kind of hope that change was going to come at last. Truth in Our Times by David McCraw.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Last night was the first night of the Democratic National Convention, the nominating and celebrating convention for Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and others. And on the line with us is our old buddy Ben Wikler. He was the Washington, D.C. director of MoveOn.org when he used to drop into our studio from time to time when we were in D.C. He is now the chairman of the Wisconsin Democratic Party. WisDems, WISDEMS.org is the website, and his Twitter handle is Ben Wikler, WIKLER. Ben, welcome back. I'm curious, first of all, how you think this is all playing out in Wisconsin. Wisconsin was one of the states in the last election that if the election numbers are accurate and hadn't been tampered with by some foreign power, went for Donald Trump, and this time seems therefore very consequential.
Wisconsin, first of all, Tom, it's great to be back with you on the program. Wisconsin is, according to most models I've seen, the tipping point state this year. If the Trump campaign said in a closed-door briefing that was recorded and leaked last year, if we win Wisconsin, we win the election. If we lose Wisconsin, we lose the election. And, of course, my goal every day is to make sure that Trump loses Wisconsin and loses the election. This is a convention that was supposed to put Milwaukee on the national stage. It was going to introduce folks to our state, a huge celebration of all things Wisconsin. It's a little different now. I have to say, there's a combination of heartbreak and elation. The heartbreak is that there isn't this infusion of $200 million in economic activity in downtown Milwaukee that Milwaukee could definitely use in the midst of Trump's coronavirus recession. The elation is that even though so many things have changed, and even though we've had to make it a virtual convention where people are tuning in from their living rooms across the country instead of gathering in person, I think the actual programming is soaring past expectations so intensely, and people are feeling this very intimate experience. Every text message I've gotten from a member of our delegation that would have been there in the arena has been overwhelmingly positive since last night. And I think the way that the convention team is knocking it out of the park, and frankly, the Biden campaign is demonstrating its ability to tell a story that threads everybody into this larger fabric. It's really powerful, and it's giving people a lot of hope in a dark time.
Yeah, I completely agree. I was very impressed last night. I commented to Louise, it seems like basically somebody sat down and said, okay, we're going to do a 2 or 3 hour, kind of infomercial thing. And I don't mean that in a dismissive or denigrating way, but a production that is designed to basically sell, this candidacy that has a very clear message and a very clear call to action in it. And we're going to use the very best production values of Hollywood and everything else, everything that we know how to do in this political context, and yet also make it very folksy, very homegrown. I loved the the Zoom call, people applauding after Michelle Obama, for example, and after Bernie Sanders and things. I was just so impressed by the whole thing. Ben, are you getting signals from people in Wisconsin that this is moving the needle, number one? And number two, I know that to a large extent, the problems in Wisconsin, in the Wisconsin election, were not in 2016, were not just caused by the fact that Hillary Clinton never bothered to visit the state, but were also caused by Wisconsin Republicans and Scott Walker throwing hundreds of thousands of people off the voting rolls, particularly in the big cities that tend to vote Democratic, and particularly among people with common minority names, African-American names, and in particular Hispanic names. Has that been cleaned up? How is Wisconsin doing now?
So I think of 2016 as a collision of two factors. On the one hand, poll after poll, every single public poll showed Clinton up. On Election Day, the average the polling average showed Clinton was going to win by 6.5 percentage points. And so the Clinton team did not think that Wisconsin was a battleground, and they invested and strategized accordingly, everything from presidential schedule to TV ads, which didn't start till October 28th. The other side of the coin was that all of these efforts to rig the system took full force in November of 2016. So not just the Russian interference that was well documented, targeting voters in Milwaukee, especially African-American voters, to sow distrust of Hillary Clinton, but also voter ID, the incredibly harsh and restrictive voter ID law. The first election where that took effect was 2016. Changes to voter registration rules to make it harder to do in-person voter registration, something that Democrats and progressives have relied on. The smashing of organized labor in Wisconsin had taken a massive toll by Election Day in 2016. All of these different efforts came together, and we lost by 22,748 votes. This time, the Republicans are just as ferocious in their attempt to try to suppress the vote. But our side knows that every vote could tip the entire presidential election in our state. We swept every election in 2018 in Wisconsin for the first time since 1982 at a statewide level. This spring, Republicans tried to do everything in their power to suppress the vote. We fought all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and our state Supreme Court. They forced the election to be held in person with very little relief for absentee voters. All the relief we got was won in court against their opposition. But we organized a massive campaign to help people sidestep the GOP's voter suppression machine, and we won a landslide, 10 percentage points, in only the second time in half a century that a sitting Supreme Court justice has lost a seat. So I think we have the kind of energy and grassroots organizing chops to go into this fall and make it look very different. And there's no shortage, let me assure you. There's a full-scale investment and focus on Wisconsin from Joe Biden and Kamala Harris all the way down to local state legislative candidates.
That is great. We're talking with Ben Wikler. He's the chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party and formerly was the D.C. director for MoveOn.org. And in that context, Ben, let me take this to a little, from the micro to the macro, from Wisconsin to the entire United States. You were talking about all the ways that Republicans have tried to prevent people from voting in Wisconsin and how successful they were, frankly, in 2016 in many of those regards. They obviously have been doing that kind of thing all over the country, particularly in those states where Republicans have control of the states. To what extent, and I'm sure you're maintaining your connections to MoveOn.org and other national groups, to what extent do you see this very successful pushback that you all have mounted in Wisconsin being replicated or variations on it being played out in other states across the country this year?
One thing that I've been thrilled to see, both among independent groups like MoveOn, where I used to work, and with state parties and the Biden campaign, which, to its great credit, has integrated with local infrastructure and is helping build local infrastructure in state parties across the country. Not something that every presidential campaign does. All across the board, folks are figuring out new ways of doing the critical age-old work of helping people cast a vote. And I've seen the public reports that MoveOn is helping train people in vote tripling, where you recruit friends you ask voters not only to commit to vote, but also to give you the first names of friends that they will have turn out. That's something we're doing also at the Democratic Party of Wisconsin, and I think it's happening across the country. The effort to track who requests an absentee ballot and then make sure that those folks get outreach about how to do it. And frankly, if the president sabotages our postal system, we'll switch gears and ask people to hand deliver their absentee ballots. That is a way of getting around this that Trump can't control. And he's freaking out because cities are putting up drop boxes for their ballots that are safe and secure that sidestep his sabotage completely. So there's a tremendous amount of ingenuity, and I think folks are learning from each other about how to make democracy work when the president wants it to fail.
Yeah. Ben, we got about 20 seconds left. Your thoughts on what we need to do to make sure that this president fails between now and Election Day?
I'll tell you the number one thing. Do everything early. Request your ballot now. Turn it in the first day you can. Recruit friends and volunteer now to get the absentee ballot request in. The earlier we do things, the less his last-minute hand grenades can blow things up. Let's organize now and win in November.
Wisconsin Democratic Party Chair Ben Wikler formerly with MoveOn.org. WisDems, WISDems.org is the website. Ben's Twitter handle, of course, Ben Wikler, Wikler. Ben, thanks so much. It's great talking to you again.
Thanks so much. Great to be back.
Great having you. We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls after this. Stick around.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
15 minutes past the hour. It's the Thom Hartmann Program, the place where despair is not an option. We will get through this. And welcome back. Let's see here. Gene in Myerstown, Pennsylvania. Hey, Gene, what's on your mind? Thanks for watching Free Speech TV.
You bet. I just want to mention my favorite all-in-one voting website. It's very easy to remember, vote.org.
Do you have to give them your address or your email address in order to use their site?
Yeah, you need that. You don't have to put your email address in there. But you can find out if you're registered in about 25 seconds. They've got all the mail-in deadlines, state by state. You can even request an absentee ballot on the site. So it's a goodie.
Okay, vote.org. Okay, I will check that out. I'm pretty sure I've looked at that website before and thought this is a useful resource.
Still there. We need to keep it simple. You know, everybody's got to get their ballot in really, really early.
Yeah, I agree. But my only concern, Gene, I don't recall who runs that site, but you know, a four-letter pure word URL can cost tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars, in some cases millions. Who put up the money for vote.org and how are they monetizing it? Or is this, you know, the project of some group of altruistic people? I don't know the answer to that, and but I'll try to find out. Unless you know the answer.
I think it says for your email address, they may send you. You know.
So they may be selling your email address. Or something.
Send you.
Let me check it out before we
opt
speculate
out
more. Yeah. Okay.
But I haven't found
Gene, thanks a lot for the call.
That much information on one site. You know.
Yeah. No. They have done a spectacular job. I do recall that. Gene, thank you. Raven in Medford, Oregon. Hey, Raven, what's up?
Hey, how are you?
Good.
So my thing is this: instead of the party constantly trying to point out the difference between Trump and Biden, is simply to say that whether or not he's going to pay the bill that's been due to people of color in this country for so long. That's what we really want to know. That's what really needs to be stated. Is he going to finally pay that bill?
Trump?
No, Biden. Is Biden going to finally pay the bill that's due to people of color in this country for so long? We don't really care what the big difference between him and between Biden and Trump are. We look at it as we get either hard racism or soft racism. We want to know if the bill that is actually due to us is going to finally be paid. If that bill had been paid, a Trump president would have never happened.
Yeah. You're talking reparations here, Raven, and it's an important.
Well, not just reparations, but in terms of the voting, housing, medical care, everything. You can't have a democracy unless you have a truly united people, and we have never been a truly united people.
Yeah, that is an excellent and really important point, and one that I think that the Democratic Party is trying to make, and is. Increasingly effectively working toward, but spot on. Raven, thank you for the call. It's coming up on 20 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls in just a moment. Stick around. It's your media support group for we the people. Talk media for the rest of us. We'll be right back. You can help America return to democracy by telling friends and family how to listen to this and other great progressive programs. Tag You're It. So we've got a new video, ThomHartmann.com, for people who support our program. It's about private equity firms. You know, Mitt Romney's company, Bain Capital, and Steve Schwartzman's Blackstone, and some of these private equity groups have long been considered risky investments. I mean, you know, billionaires put money into these things. But and sometimes they produce really high returns, but they also have huge fees, and they operate kind of like a black box. There's all kinds of hidden stuff. And what they have been salivating about for years, Schwartzman talked about this just a few days after Donald Trump was inaugurated, was they wanted to get their hands on people's 401ks and IRAs, people's retirement money, their pension funds. And it's been illegal. And Trump and Eugene Scalia, the head of the Labor Department, just legalized this practice. The consequences could be dramatic. The video's over at ThomHartmann.com. Well, welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. So I was, before the break, I was talking about these 6 key takeaways from pandemic data on American households. This is from Bloomberg, that a third of people this month, a third of people in America are concerned that they will not be able to pay their rent or mortgage. That 127 million Americans have experienced a loss of income since mid-March. And I guarantee you, when employers start hiring and hiring back, they're going to be paying less than they were before, because there's going to be a lot of people looking for jobs, and employers are going to be sitting in the catbird seat. In fact, I'm certain that's already going on, and it probably accounts for this statistic. 127 million Americans saw their pay go down. More than a third of New Yorkers experience housing insecurity. In other words, they're on the edge of homelessness. 40% of people living in Houston. More than half of all households have experienced a loss of income since March. We're looking at 23.8 million people who don't have enough to eat. To eat. And the CDC said in May and June, fully 10% of adults seriously considered suicide. These are shocking statistics that all came out of the fact that Donald Trump chose not to use science to respond to a pandemic, but instead chose to make it political, to use it to create chaos. He's loving the fact that large swaths of America who typically vote Democratic, older people who think about Medicare and Social Security, are afraid to go vote and want to vote by mail, and he can blow that up by messing with the Postal Service. He is loving this. And then we get this. The Oregon Bankers Association, this is from Bill Rogaway in the Oregonian, our local newspaper here. Now, this is just one state, but I would bet anything that the same thing is being done by bankers associations or similar trade groups in every state. But here it is. This is Oregon. We have a state law. Our state legislature passed a law saying that you may not evict people until the last day of September or the first day of October. And I believe that the governor might have extended that for another month. She has the ability to do that. So here's the story, straight up. And this, I think, gives you some insight into how the business community is dealing with this crisis. At least those members of the business community who are the takers, as it were. They take your rent, they take your mortgage, they sit in their fancy homes and in their mansions and in their gated communities and have people deliver things to them, no contact, and they're not all that worried about what's going on, right? They don't have to interact. In fact, they can get 15-minute rapid tests. They can hop on their private jets and go to places where there's no COVID or very little. So here's the story. The Oregon Bankers Association sued to overturn part of a new state law that protects homeowners from foreclosure and other penalties if they can't pay their mortgages during the pandemic. An attorney for the bankers said he wasn't sure if lenders might seek to take homes through civil litigation rather than foreclosure. So here's the thing. The state said, you can't foreclose on these homes. So the lawyer says, an enterprising reporter who understands real estate law says to the lawyer for the Oregon Bankers Association, well, foreclosure is not the only way to take a person's home away from them. You can sue them for the home, and if they fail in court, if they can't meet your lawsuit, they lose their home too. And so they asked the attorney for the bankers, are you going to do that? And the attorney for the bankers said, I'm not saying. The law applies, this from this article by Mike Rogaway in the Oregonian. The law applies through September, but authorizes the governor to extend its provisions until a later date. The bankers' lawsuit was filed in U.S. District Court in Eugene. This is a federal lawsuit. They're claiming that Oregon has preempted the U.S. Constitution. It argues that Oregon's new law constitutionally preempts federal law and unfairly, to who? Oh, that's right, to the rich guys who own the mortgages. Unfairly seeks to establish retroactive protections beginning March 8th. The suit also seeks to reverse provisions of the new Oregon law that prevent banks from enacting fees, higher interest rates, or other charges for non-payment during the pandemic. So right now here in Oregon, if you're late making your mortgage payment, not only can they not kick you out of your house, they can't hit you with a late fee. They can't hit you with penalties. They can't jack your interest rate from 3% up to 16%. They can't do that by law. And the Oregon bankers are saying, what? We want to be able to hit people with fees. We want to be able to jack up people's interest rates. Screwing our customers is our business model. We're banks. And the question now is whether some federal judge, a third of them in the country right now, appointed by Donald Trump, is going to say, yeah, that's really not fair to those banksters and the billionaires and the wealthy people who own the buildings. And it's just not fair to them. We'll be back. It's coming up on 28 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Back with your calls in just a minute.
Our selection today for the Thom Hartmann Book Club is This Land, How Cowboys, Capitalism, and Corruption Are Ruining the American West by Christopher Ketchum. This is from Chapter 1. It's about halfway through the chapter. He's talking about Bernard DeVoto. DeVoto was the first major historian of the West who was also an environmentalist and an activist, the first chronicler of what Wallace Stenger called the West's curious desire to rape itself. DeVoto was a Westerner raised in Utah. He suffered in the provincialism and intolerance of Mormon country, went east to study, and then teach at Harvard, settled in Cambridge, but never forgot the beauty of his native ground. Loving the land and history, said a magazine profile, but loathing the society. His histories, novels, criticism, his essays in Harper's Magazine were for 20 years he wrote the oldest column in American journalism, Easy Chair, pointed always west. His trilogy, published in the 1940s, The Year of Decision, Across the Wide Missouri, and The Course of Empire, garnered the Pulitzer, the Bancroft, and the National Book Award. Widely celebrated, DeVoto used his position to become his generation's most outspoken defender of the public lands. He called the West a plundered province, a resource colony for corporations and absentee landlords who practiced, quote, an economy of liquidation. He was broad in his assault on the liquidators. He went after the timbermen, the mining companies, the stockmen, the cattle barons, the oilmen and gasmen, the overgrazers, the deforesters, the denuders, the profiteers of gold rushes and grass rushes. He named the bankers and congressmen who abetted the plundering, the Western hogs, he called them. They've been busy for a century laying waste to the West. Long before the public domain was vested with any permanence legally in the hands of the American people, before there was a consideration of the land itself or any environmental ethic, The West had been torn up, beaten down, subjected to the greed and profligacy of the commodity users. Ironically, the users, in their race to liquidate, helped drive the creation of the public land system we know today, as they proved the need for federal stewardship to stop their abuses. Massive timber frauds in the 19th century, the largest land frauds seen in the West, led directly to the establishment of the Forest Service in the 20th century, its purpose to stop deforestation. Out-of-control cattle numbers in the steppe, overgrazing that turned the fragile soil to dust, led directly to the federal grazing regulatory system that eventually became the BLM. When in 1946 the commodity users conspired to destroy the public land system, the system in which Devoto saw the only hope for Western conservation and preservation, he stood to oppose them. Quote, he was the first conservationist in nearly half a century, except for Franklin D. Roosevelt, to command a national audience, said Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., a student of his at Harvard. No one did more in the post-war years to rouse public opinion against the spoilers than Devoto. Devoto and Schlesinger had seen firsthand what unregulated industry could wreak in the arid lands when they drove cross-country together in the spring of 1940 and entered western Kansas past the 100th meridian. These were the last years of the Dust Bowl before FDR's soil conservation programs and the return rains of the 40s could heal the land. Wrote Devoto, a cemetery was 10 inches deep in sand. Half the headstones had toppled into it and been partly covered. Sagging shacks that had been farmhouses had their windows blown out, and dust was 2 or 4 or 6 feet deep against their western walls and a foot deep against the far wall. A repulsive dust as fine as sifted flour. Now, 6 years after that trip with Schlesinger, Devoto was confronted with the West's cattle barons, the liquidators of the grass, who were hell-bent on reducing the region to the same mess of dust. In 1946, the Joint Committee on Public Lands of the American National Livestock Association met in Salt Lake City to discuss the goal of undermining what few regulations had been placed on livestock operators under the newly formed Bureau of Land Management. The stock growers' ambition went further than mere deregulation. They hatched a plan with the help of friends in Congress to begin moving all federal land, the BLM and Forest Service domain, as well as the national parks, into the control of the states. The plan evolved through 1946, 47, 48, with legislation making its way on Capitol Hill. Devoto covered the story for Harper's. He cautioned that the stock growers were attempting, quote, one of the biggest land grabs in American history. The public lands are first to be transferred to the states on the wholly justified assumption that there should be a state government not wholly compliant to the desires of stock growers. It could be pressured into compliance, he wrote in Harper's. Nothing in history suggests the states are adequate to protect their own resources or even want to, or suggests that cattlemen and sheepmen are capable of regulating themselves even for their own benefit, still less the public's, end quote. The long-term plan, he said, was to get rid of the public lands altogether, to place the common possession of the American people into private hands. The livestock industry went on the attack, mounted a PR campaign to discredit Devoto, and pressured Harper's to cease its support. Unmoved, the magazine continued for 3 years to publish his relentless exposés of the intrigues in the state houses and in the Western Caucus. Devoto had convinced the editors, when no other publication that mattered in the East cared, that the threat of such land transfer was an existential one. This Land by Christopher Ketchum.
Coming up on the Science Revolution, Noah Greenwald from the Center for Biological Diversity is here on Trump's latest actions to weaken the Endangered Species Act. You know, as we destroy the wild, we destroy ourselves. Dr. Justin A. Frank, MD, drops by and says it is terrifying to have a president who is psychotic and explains why Trump hates anyone who is loved. Former Assistant Secretary for Health under Obama, Dr. Howard Koh, tells us how Biden will handle this pandemic we're in. And lastly, in Geeky Science, we find out how our bones are made of stars. The Science Revolution, wherever fine podcasts are available. Hi, Thom Hartmann here. In my new book, The Hidden History of Monopolies, How Big Business Destroyed the American Dream, I'll be taking you from the birth of America as a revolt against monopoly, remember the Boston Tea Party, to the largely successful efforts of both Presidents Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt and other like-minded leaders to constrain corporations' monopolistic urges, to the massive changes in the rules of business starting during the Reagan Revolution that have brought us into the cancer stage of capitalism. In the foreword by Ralph Nader, he says, "This is the most important dynamic book on the cancers of monopoly by giant corporations written in our generation." End quote. It's the fourth in my Hidden History series, available where all fine books are sold. And don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. Democracy starts with you. Tag, you're it. And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. On the line with us is Adrian Shelley. Adrian is the director of the Public Citizen Texas office, citizen.org. And Adrian's Twitter handle is Adrian Shelley, Shelley. Adrian, welcome to the program. Tell me about the Trump administration's rollback of the methane rules. First of all, what were they, what are they now, and why does this matter?
Hey, Tom, thanks for having me on. So, this is just the latest effort by the Trump administration to undo public health and safety rules that were put in place during the Obama administration. This rule is about methane emissions from the oil and gas industry. Methane accounts for about 10% of our greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, so it is a major driver of climate change. And as oil and gas drilling has exploded across the United States, and especially in places like Pennsylvania and Texas, methane emissions have increased dramatically. So we're talking about climate change, but we're also talking about health and environmental impacts for people who live in places like West Texas, where there's a lot of oil and gas drilling going on.
So if methane accounts for 10% of our is this Texas-wide or nationwide, 10% of our greenhouse gas emissions?
This is nationwide. Most of us think of carbon dioxide as the main greenhouse gas pollutant driver of climate change, but methane is actually 84 times as potent as CO2. So we have less.
Well, that's where I was going.
Emissions.
If it's 80 times more potent and it's 10% of our emissions, then it's 800. I'm doing math in my head is not my strong point, but that means it's a far more consequential greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide.
It's about 10% of the effects in the United States, but in certain places,
I see.
It's a huge driver. Yeah. So, in Texas, for example, in the Permian Basin, we just had an explosion of drilling out there in the last couple of years. We are wasting 1.4 million metric tons of methane every year in Texas. That would produce enough energy to power every house in Dallas and Houston combined, and we're just wasting it right now.
By just letting it gas out into the environment?
Yeah, we let it leak into the environment. We burn it off because it's inconvenient to sell it into the market. It's just the latest symptom of what the oil and gas industry is up to these days, which frankly is kind of an 11th hour grab. This is an industry whose days are numbered and is getting increasingly reckless in its operations.
So what was the law and what is the law or will be the law if Trump's rollback of these regulations stand?
Sure. So these were some pretty practical controls. There's been a rule in place since 2016. It included programs for leak detection, finding errant emissions of methane and ending them. It included transmission and storage, so not just the wellhead, but the pipelines, the compressor stations, things like that. Those were included in the rule, and they have been accepted now. So it's basically undoing rules that were already in place. And in fact, rules that industry supported. The Obama-era rules were supported by Shell, ExxonMobil, BP, companies that understand that methane is a major problem and that people are demanding solutions. So it's
so who paid Trump to undo these?
He is. He's undoing them. He's undoing them.
No, but I mean, who paid for that? Who lobbied him to make that happen?
We're not really sure. We think, frankly, that it's just part of the Trump vendetta against the Obama administration. There have been plenty of rules that have been undone, even though industry isn't asking for them. This rule, when it was originally proposed, it was supposed to save industry $19 million a year, which sounds like a lot to you and me, but for companies like ExxonMobil and Shell, a couple $1 million a year is nothing.
Yeah, it's like 16 minutes of revenue or something.
Sure, it's a rounding error. So it's not a rule that industry was even asking for. We went to Dallas and we spoke in opposition of this rule repeal, and there were representatives from industry right there next to us saying that they were okay with this rule. They were already operating under it. It was helping them to save product. And there wasn't any need to roll it back, but here we are.
We're talking with Adrian Shelley, the director of the Public Citizen Office in Texas. Citizen.org is the website. Adrian Shelley is the Twitter handle, and Public Citizen TX as well. Adrian, final question, I guess, is what can we do about this, and what are you guys doing about this specifically down in Texas?
Well, we spoke out against the federal rule repeal, and we asked our members to do the same. We had folks across the United States tell the EPA that they didn't want this rule repeal. It is happening. Some of our efforts kind of falling on deaf ears. We're also turning to state regulators. Here in Texas, it's the Railroad Commission that regulates oil and gas, and they are seriously considering controls to limit methane pollution. It just makes sense. We want energy independence in the United States, and that means using the resources that we have rather than wasting them. So we're appealing to our state regulators as well as our federal regulators, and we're asking people to do the same thing.
Great. Adrian Shelley, Citizen.org, Public Citizen in Texas. Adrian, thanks for dropping by. It's great talking with you.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure, and you are always welcome here. Let's pick up some phone calls here. Paul in Natick, Massachusetts. Hey, Paul, what's on your mind today?
Hey, thanks for having me on. Listen, I have something that's been really bothering me, and because we're losing the White House and because we're in a tough election this time around, I think our messaging really needs some work. We seem to be coming off of our back heel talking all about Donald Trump when we have some great ideas of our own, and we should be getting people excited about what we want to do and what we think the country needs. And
I don't know if did you miss the convention last night, Paul? Did you miss Bernie's speech? Did you miss what happened? I mean, it was all about what we want to do. I thought that it was absolutely brilliant. There was a lot of positive stuff. I don't think that when your house is on fire that you can ignore that fact. And when there's an arsonist standing in front of your house who just lit it on fire, you can ignore that fact either, Paul. You've got to address that. And the simple fact of the matter is the polling shows that the majority of people who are planning on voting for Joe Biden are actually voting against Donald Trump. Let's use that.
But I don't think we're doing the right thing by using that, because we're just going to end up losing an election because we're not getting people excited about Joe Biden, and we're not getting people excited about Kamala Harris. And all of this.
Yeah, I think people are, Paul, and I'm willing to cut you a little slack and assume that you're not just another one of these Republican concerned trolls who first time caller to the show, that the RNC is paying to say, well, I'm kind of worried about the Democratic Party. I'm just going to assume that you're not one of those fools. Robert in South Hadley. Actually, Robert, I've only got 30 seconds to the break. Let me put you on hold, and I'll pick you up on the other side of this. As I pointed out yesterday, we had two of these concerned trolls who got through yesterday. Again, I don't know if the last caller was one or not, but I'm starting to flag these callers. As you know, our call screening software keeps track of every phone number that calls in, and we can flag folks. And it's got caller ID and all that kind of stuff. But I'm just saying, get ready. You're going to see this a lot on Twitter, on Facebook, and people who get past a call screener into this show of, oh, well, I'm just really worried the Democrats aren't, and the Democrats this, and Joe Biden isn't good enough, and he's not progressive. Oh, maybe we should talk about. Our damn house is on fire. There's nothing wrong with talking about that. We'll be back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Back with more of your calls in just a moment. It's 15 minutes before the top of the hour. Hang on just a second. I'm just noting concern troll on that caller's profile. There we go. Robert, I'll pick you up after the break because you're listening on Sirius XM and you guys are in a break. Jill in West Collingwood Heights, New Jersey. Hey, Jill, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I just found free speech, and I just want to say thank you for all you do.
You're welcome. Thanks for watching us. Tell your friends.
It's often said of Trump that he's incapable of empathy. But I recently came across a word which seems to describe him more accurately that I want to get out in the general vocabulary, and it's schadenfreude.
Oh, yeah.
It takes
a person who derives pleasure from the misery of others.
Yes, joy in others' pain, power to cause others pain, authority, etc. And it just seems to take that lack of empathy much deeper and describe him better.
Yeah. Schadenfreude is, it's a German word. There's not a literal English equivalent, but...
yes, I speak German. I lived there for a while.
Yeah, I lived there for a year, and I speak German also. And I've always heard it used in kind of a soft context, but I think Trump takes it beyond that, and I don't think that there's even a word for this. I think he doesn't just get some small pleasure from the suffering of others. I think he delights in it. I think it's what animates him. I think it's the driving force of his life is creating misery among other people, those people that he has identified as, those who don't love him enough or those who are not loyal enough to him or whatever it may be. And maybe there's a German word for that, Jill?
I don't know. But I just think that, it just explains how he can separate families, cage children, even sharper spikes in the wall, or his childish name calling even. It's just... I'm
with you. I would say a lot of that just falls into the large umbrella or basket rather of psychopathy. But I'm with you, Jill. Thank you. Thanks for bringing a word to us. Randy in Portland. Hey, Randy, what's on your mind?
Well, she just reminded me of another word in Scottish that's cockwaddle, an ignorant person who thinks too much of themselves. But
that's in Scottish, exactly, you said?
Scottish, yeah, cockwaddle.
Huh. Okay.
Look it up. Well, anyway.
Yeah, I'll believe you.
Ben Wikler reminded me of a German song which basically said, will there be dancing after the dark times? And the answer is yes, there will be dancing about the dark times. And
meaning
that might be that we're passing through this dark time ourselves, and there'll be light at the end of the tunnel, and there'll be dancing to celebrate when we get there.
From your lips to God's ears, Randy. I sure hope you're right. I'm actually quite optimistic. It looks like this is going to be a blowout election, and Donald Trump by bragging his irrepressibility, his bragging about how he's going to sabotage the post office in his phone call with Fox News. I think he shot himself in the foot. Or more specifically, he shot Louis DeJoy in the foot. So we'll see how this plays out. But I don't think it's going to work out well for Donald Trump. On the other hand, they've already dismantled a bunch of these machines in largely Democratic cities. Those were all the targets, were places where Hillary Clinton won, and swing states. The hidden history of guns and the Second Amendment tells how the Second Amendment was written to protect Georgia's slave patrols. And welcome back. Finishing up with your phone calls here. Robert in South Hadley, Massachusetts. Hey, Robert, what's on your mind?
Good afternoon, Tom. I have a question about effectively allocating campaign contributions. In the past, I've donated to Bernie and Elizabeth, and now I get solicitations from Move On, Act Blue, Donate, and we'll divide your contribution among several congressional candidates. So I'm just trying to decide, with limited funds, how do you decide where to most effectively put these things, whether it's flip the Senate or individual campaigns or Act Blue or Move On?
Right. Act Blue is basically a payment processing system that is, I believe, owned by one of the Podesta brothers. And, they take a small, a tip, right, a small percentage. Or if you allow them to, and they make enough off the people who say, yes, let me give you a tip, that all the people who say, no, I'm not going to give you a tip, they can afford to process. If they're slicing and dicing candidates and pitching that to people, they're doing so in the hopes that you'll say, yes, here's a tip. I'm not, it's great that they're there. They have made it possible for candidates to do fundraising without building a back-end accounting infrastructure, which is just wonderful. They're doing good work, but I don't see them as progressive activists or anything. Move On obviously has a long history of doing good work. Indivisible is another organization that has a long history of doing good work. But personally, for myself, Robert, I look at individual candidates, and when an individual candidate does something that I think is really cool, when Ayanna Pressley says something, or AOC does something, or a candidate here in Oregon that I support does or says something, I like to reward them by sending a small contribution, even sometimes $10 or $15, more often 25 or 30. But I'm not desperate for cash right now, so I can afford to do that. But that's how I've been doing it, and I suspect a lot of people are doing it that way.
Yeah, sure. So directly to the candidate that you like, as opposed to wondering where exactly it's going.
Yeah,
divide it up.
And generally it goes to generally it goes out to through Act Blue anyway. so
right.
But that's what I would do. Robert, I need to move along, but thank you for the call. It's a great question. Dave, Dave, what's on your mind today?
Oh, thank you for having me on, Mr. Hartmann. Hey, I had to go there. What do you think about from your guest you had earlier talking about making it more easier for people to vote, and especially to vote early? What do you think about like Trump's people, like someone like the Boogaloo Boys showing up like brown shirts and doing, in other words, the question would be, do you think concerning these mailboxes is going to be a concern? Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, I do, Dave. And it's a good question, and not a concern troll question. and my take on this, the Washington Post reported a little while ago that the RNC is hiring 50,000 people to be, quote, poll watchers. Now, the reason why this is consequential, and it might be something like we've never before seen in America, or at least not since the 80s, is that back in the 60s and 70s, the Republican Party would hire people like William Rehnquist, who then later became the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, but a big, tall bear of a guy, white guy, to stand outside Black, Hispanic, Native American polling places and basically loudly challenge people's right to vote, or force them into provisional ballots which don't get counted. Democrats fought back, and they got a restraining order against the Republican Party for doing this nationwide. And that restraining order got renewed it started in the late 70s or early 80s. It got renewed in the 90s, and it expired last year. Actually, it expired in the middle of 2018. But they haven't, in 2018, they didn't have a real coordinated effort around its expiration date. So this will be the first election in basically 30 or 40 years where the Republican Party legally can have, tattoo-covered bikers, off-duty police officers in uniform, right-wingers with AR-15s in open carry states standing at the polls loudly challenging voters. Now, that said, I think that the general mood of the Democratic electorate, the Democratic Party electorate, is screw those guys. You're not going to intimidate me. So I'm not as worried about it as I would have been in the past because I think so many people are so activated and so pissed off, but it is going to happen. It is actually going to happen. Michelle in Denver. Hey, Michelle, what's up?
We're excited about Joe Biden. There are things that you learn about somebody during these conventions. That's why I like them. He's a decent, kind human being, and he actually cares about the American people. The fact that he talked to the train conductor, the fact that he would talk to just ordinary citizens on that train tells you he's a kind, decent human being, if nothing else, and that he cares about people's plights. He called the guy that had the heart attack, that was the train conductor. Who does that on a normal basis? These are things you should be excited about. We have the people that care on our side. They're not perfect. Can they work on things? Yes. But they care about the American people, and that should be enough to get people excited right now, because the mess we're in, because we have a president who doesn't, who could care less whether a guy had his knee stepped on for 9 minutes, or care less that 171,000 people have died. That should be enough to excite you. I'm kind of tired of our party getting bashed by people who don't see the importance of having people in office who actually give a dang about whether they live or die, or give a dang about how much money they make, or give a dang about what you do on an everyday basis. We've got to change the culture in our country.
Michelle, I got to wrap it up, but thank you for the call. Spot on, and thank you for rebutting our concerned troll caller. As I said, you're going to see these concerned trolls all over social media. Screw them, right? To hell with them. I don't know how to say it more clearly. And I will continue to point it out when they call into this program. We'll be back tomorrow. In the meantime, get out there, get active, tag "You're It." Our democracy's at stake. Our house is on fire. Have a good afternoon, a great afternoon. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit ThomHartmann.com.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are Raycon Earbuds. Stay at home with better sound. More info at buyraycon.com/Tom. Omega XL, which according to clinical research helps joints. More info at omegaxl.com/Tom. CB Distillery, CBD for sleeping. More info at cbdistillery.com, code TOM. The Clean Phone Pro, phone sanitizer and charger. More info at thenewdealshop.com. Keeps hair loss treatment. More info at keeps.com/Tom. And Teeth, Smarter Pet Dental Health. For more info, teeth.com, code TOM.
We say fight back!
Book is out, The Hidden History of Monopolies, How Big Business Destroyed the American Dream. We're having a coronavirus-safe book tour. I'll be at Powell's virtual bookstore event in conversation with David Corton, Tuesday, August 25th at 5 p.m. Pacific time. Go to powells.com and get your tickets for the live stream event. And on Friday, September 4th at 6 p.m. Pacific time, I'll be at a Town Hall Seattle virtual event, and you can get your tickets for that live stream event at townhallseattle.org. There are also links at thomhartmann.com. I'll be taking you from the birth of America through FDR to the Reagan Revolution and today. In the foreword of my book, Ralph Nader says, "This is the most important, dynamic book on the cancers of monopoly by giant corporations written in our generation," end quote. So be sure to go to thomhartmann.com and sign up for one of these two great virtual book signings, Powell's in Portland and Town Hall Seattle.